My name is Ethan Mercer. I was 28 years old when it happened, October 18th, 2018. People in Livonia will tell you it's the sort of place where porch lights stay on until midnight and kids still ride bikes to the corner store without a chaperone. That's the picture I drew for myself when I moved into Briarfield Estates. Neat lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs, a library with creaky floors, and a diner that kept the coffee hot until 2 in the morning. I liked the smallness of it. It felt like a town that made sense. It felt safe. That makes the story harder to tell and, I think, more important, because the thing that undid me was not a dark alley or a highway at 2 a.m. It was the ordinary things in the ordinary places I trusted. Before that October, my life read like a late summer teen movie. I taught high school English at Westbridge High, where I could rattle off Baldwin and Baldwin-adjacent poets with a passion that made students roll their eyes and then sometimes listen. I drank too much coffee, I played guitar on the quiet nights, and I had a steady rhythm with my girlfriend, Claire. Claire worked at the museum downtown, local history displays, and the occasional traveling exhibit. She loved old photographs. She loved the way a face or a storefront captured a decade like an open book. We'd talk about small things, the kind of things couples attach to, like talismans, how to fold fitted sheets, whether to repaint the kitchen or leave the cabinets mid-century, whether to finally get a dog. The cast around me felt like a carefully chosen chorus. Marcus Reed had been my best friend since college. He taught physics and kept an immaculate 1967 Mustang he called Lulu. Angela Whitcomb lived 3 houses down and ran the bakery on Broadway. She delivered cinnamon rolls to Claire and me on bad days like homemade therapy. Tom Briggs mowed lawns for everyone on our block and knew too much about everyone else. Even Officer Donovan, the local cop who ran community outreach, could make you feel like everything was under watchful, benevolent eyes. Briarfield itself was odd in one particular way. At the edge of it stood a block of townhouses from another era, dark brick with narrow windows, fenced off from the newer developments. Kids dared each other to creep up to the wrought iron gate, but rumor had it the place, Dunwell Row, had been vacant for years. There were stories, of course, old live oak roots of rumor that fed themselves. A fire in the 1950s, a judge who once lived there, an inheritance dispute that turned ugly. You could ask 10 people and get 10 narratives. I never cared much for them. Ghost stories are comfortable from a distance. They're like the marshmallow fluff you roast on a warm summer night, sweet and harmless. In the months before the incident, 2 smaller things began to fray that picture. First, I found myself awake in the small hours more often than before, the kind of wakefulness that pins you to the mattress and lets your thoughts circle like uncaged birds. Teaching had become a grind of meetings and new testing standards. The school board pushed for metrics that made poetry feel like an impractical indulgence. Second, Claire started spending longer hours cataloging donations at the museum. At first, we shrugged off the strain as the inevitable pressure of grown-up commitments. Then, after a late shift, she came home with a photograph she couldn't stop staring at, a black portrait of a boy with a crooked smile, tucked into an envelope with no label. She told me the donor had left it without a name and that someone in the archives thought the boy might be connected to Dunwell Row. "It's just a face," she said, "but there's something about the eyes." She held the print like a fragile coin. When she handed it to me, I felt the same tug, the uncanny sensation that an ordinary thing was a hinge to something larger. The day that real worry crept in, the day that would change everything, began with rain. It was one of those steady gray October rains that flatten the world and make voices soft. The kind of weather that makes you think of endings and decisions. Marcus called that morning about an old amplifier he wanted to sell. Claire texted that she'd be late. The museum had an unexpected delivery. I had a staff meeting at school, but decided to forgo it. My chest felt heavy, and I told myself I'd rest. I walked the long way down to the diner for coffee. The streets slumped with season and the day feeling like an exhale. At the diner, Tom Briggs waved me in. The old counter smelled like frying oil and something sugary from the pastry case. We talked about trivial things. The crabapple tree in his yard, a baseball game he'd gone to as a kid, the state of the town council. He mentioned, as if it were nothing, that he'd seen a light in one of the Dunwell Row windows last week. Figured maybe someone's squatting, he said, or a city inspector coming by. I laughed then, the nervous sort of laugh you give a stranger in a checkout line. But when I walked home, the thought stuck to my shoes. Over the next week, small, almost trivial things began to pile up. My bike seat was nudged slightly on 2 different mornings. A package Claire had ordered for the house, some antique candlesticks she'd found online, arrived a day earlier than expected, left on our porch with no note. Once at dusk, I passed a man on Dunwell Row who nodded at me with too much familiarity. He wore a flannel and a beard, and his eyes were retired in a way I can't describe. Like old photographs that have lost their glossy finish. People in town didn't connect these things. They were small. Livonia was good at small things, but they attracted my attention, the way dust shows up in a narrow beam of light. I started to wake earlier, to look out the blinds, to take different routes home. Claire laughed at me, at first gently, then with the kind of worry I could feel in her voice. "You're being silly," she told me one night, turning down the lamp near the couch. She held my hand as if she could braid the unease into something manageable. She was the anchor. It was somewhere around that 7th night of not sleeping that the household sounds rearranged themselves. The house, in a way I hadn't noticed before, had new acoustics. The radiator hummed lower, the refrigerator gave a small mechanical cough a second longer than before. I chalked it up to my fraying nerves. But then I discovered a single hairline scratch on the inside of our back door. A pale white line against the paint that hadn't been there before. It was not deep, barely a mark. But to me it read like a subscription. Someone had been in the space we assumed private. I cleaned it with a cloth and took the paint sample to the hardware store like a prisoner seeking release. That scratch was the hinge. Up to that point, everything had been atmosphere and rumor and a low-level anxiety I thought I could control. After the scratch, the story tightened its hold. I started keeping the kitchen light on at night and left a chair propped against the back door. I told myself these were sensible precautions. I told myself Claire was worrying because she loved me. In truth, I was only postponing the inevitable, the moment whatever had been circling us would decide to enter. It was the sound in the middle of the night that finally undid me, a small, deliberate series of knocks at the back door, spaced long and slow like someone counting their breaths. The clock read 3 in the morning. The knocks stopped. I held my breath until the air felt thick, a trapped thing inside my ribs. That was when the main story began, when the ordinary lines of my life snapped and something stranger took its place. But you won't get the main story just yet. The last thing I told you before the night of the knocks was that Livonia felt safe. That belief, I'll say now, is what made everything worse. Because terror, the sort that rearranges your sense of self, finds the smallest, most ordinary cracks to slip through. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The knock at 3 in the morning made the house small and sudden. It was precise, 3 slow, deliberate taps like a metronome measured to someone else's heartbeat. Claire and I both sat up at the same time, the kind of simultaneous motion that feels like muscle memory. The kitchen clock glowed 3. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street had the clean, washed look of something waiting to be inspected. I went to the back door first, the beam of the hallway light slicing the dark. The chain was on. I hadn't taken it off since I discovered the scratch. I pressed my ear to the door and could hear nothing but the house breathing. The faint rattle of heat through the radiator, the refrigerator's low complaint, and something else, a soft scraping sound a long way off, like a shoe brushing gravel. "Don't open it," Claire whispered behind me. Her voice was small, raw with worry. She stayed by the kitchen island, one hand on the butcher block, the other gripping the photograph she'd slipped into her pocket the night before. The boy's eyes in that black and white print seemed to look at everything now, as if he was watching us watch him. I fumbled with the chain and cracked the door an inch. A cold finger of air struck my face. There was a smear of mud on the threshold, the kind you get from a yard after rain. Not fresh, partly dry, like it had been stepped in and tracked a little. On the porch, a single small footprint marked the wood, narrow, childish, with a faint heel in the arc of toes. It was too small for anyone I knew, too precise to be an animal. "Call Donovan," I said, My voice came out as a thing I didn't recognize. Claire's fingers trembled over her cell. Officer Donovan arrived within 20 minutes, his cruiser lights off so we wouldn't draw attention. He was thorough in that plain, procedural way of people who see a lot of ordinary trouble. He photographed the footprint, took notes, asked the usual questions. Had we left a window open? Any strange cars? Anyone knocked before? I told him about the scratch, the package, the man I'd seen on Dunwell Row. He nodded and reassured us with the practiced calm of a man who has heard panic before. "It could be a squatter," he suggested. "Someone coming off Dunwell. We'll run a foot patrol tonight, check the alleys. If it's a kid, we'll find him and get him home." His optimism was workable. It let us believe for a little while that whatever had visited our threshold had no larger motive than shelter. Donovan left us with promises and a business card. He told us to keep the lights on and to call immediately if anything else happened. That night, nothing happened, nothing we could prove. But the unease thickened. The photograph of the boy sat on the kitchen table as if he'd decided to stay. Claire would pick it up and rub the corner with her thumb, studying his smile the way someone studies a wrapped gift, trying to find the seam. "I can't leave this alone," she said once. "He's connected to Dunwell Row somehow. I can feel it." She started going into work earlier and later, spending hours in the archive with Lydia Price, the museum's head archivist. Lydia was a small, exact woman with round glasses and a love of catalog numbers. When Claire told me what she was doing, I felt both proud and terrified. She moved through that archive like a diver moving through light, careful, determined, pulling at threads. On a rainy Thursday, Claire brought home an envelope from Lydia. It was unmarked and thin, and inside was an old ledger page with names and dates written in cramped, practiced hands. One list was of births. Another was of children enrolled in a nearby program in the 1950s. I remember the way Claire's fingers shook when she pointed to a name, Samuel Alden, born 1947. Next to the name, in a later hand, the ledger noted, "Missing, 10/12/1955. That was the first real link. Dunwell Row, it turned out, was not simply a story of decayed houses. It had belonged to a small boarding house in the 50s where families, some poor, many transient, lodged for a while. The museum's files mentioned a fire and a handful of disappearances over the years. Some had been explained: runaways, relocations, adoptions that fell through. Others had a seam that never quite closed. Samuel Alden was one of those seams. Claire's face changed the night she read the ledger. The soft warmth her presence usually carried cooled into a hard, purposeful light. "They wrote him down as missing," she said, her voice even, like someone reading from a list while balancing a stack of plates. Samuel's photograph is similar to this one. Lydia said the donor gave the picture without any provenance. "Maybe it's coincidence," I said, because saying it felt safer than the alternative. She shook her head. "It's not," she said. "Not anymore." After that, small things multiplied. A child's drawing, a crude house with 3 stick figures, appeared, placed carefully on our kitchen counter one morning. It showed a house with a tall chimney, and beneath the porch, a little rectangle shaded in dark. On the back of the paper, written in a shaky hand, a single word, "Come." Claire cried that night, not the soft crying that follows a stubbed toe, but the kind of wailing that occupies the throat and makes the room tilt. Marcus tried to tell me it was vandalism, that someone was playing games. Angela brought over cinnamon rolls and tried to joke about Halloween pranks. But pranks have a certain warmth, a shared laughter between perpetrators and victims. This felt colder, like an intrusion without a human laugh attached. Officer Donovan increased the patrols. He recorded our statements and promised to place Dunwell Row under closer watch. But the town had a limit to how long it would hold its attention. After 2 weeks, the patrols tapered. Donovan stopped by occasionally, his greeting a little too quick, his eyes elsewhere. "Keep the doors locked," he'd say, and leave us with a smile that no longer reached his mouth. Claire became more focused. She spent hours with Lydia, piecing together obituaries and property records. She made copies of microfilm and brought them home in a stack. I would catch her at midnight, lit by a desk lamp, tracing names on the page as if they were constellations she could connect into meaning. Once, after a long stretch of searching, she looked up and told me quietly, "Samuel lived in Dunwell with his mother and a man named Arthur Grimes. The last listing for their address is October 1955. That evening, the radio in our living room, which had been off for months, began to play a song at 2:13 a.m., a tinny, backwards-sounding lullaby that made the hairs on my arms stand up. There was no power surge, no explanation. It started playing softly and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Claire sat up and listened as if the radio were a doorway. We both heard at the edge beneath the melody a sound like a child's breath. I told myself then that the story had moved beyond coincidence. Whatever had been nudging at the edges of our lives wanted notice. It wanted, perhaps, to be uncovered, or it wanted us to look away. When dawn arrived, it didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of clarity, one that looked at the past and saw how it folded into the present. Claire packed a small bag and told me she was going back to the museum for a full day. If Samuel's case was buried, someone buried it on purpose, she said. And if someone buried it on purpose, then someone knows something. Promise me you'll be careful, I said, which was a weak promise because it was all I had to offer. She kissed my forehead and walked out into the morning that smelled like wet pavement and decisions. As she closed the door, I realized we had stepped off the map of ordinary days. The town we thought we knew was a book with torn pages. We had no idea what name would fall out next. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The museum smelled of dust and old glue, the kind of smell that holds on to secrets the way water holds onto a shoreline. Claire moved through the stacks with the certainty of someone who had spent years learning the language of paper and ink. Lydia met her at the back with a manila folder the color of old bone. "We found something late," Lydia said, eyes bright in the way they get when a puzzle is about to be solved or a wound is about to be reopened. Inside the folder were letters, brittle, slanted cursive from the 1950s, tied with a red ribbon that had long since faded. Most were mundane, grocery lists, short notes about rent, but one stood out. Addressed to Mr. H. Grimes, it was signed simply A. The handwriting belonged to a woman named Margaret Alden, Samuel's mother. She wrote with a clarity that made the lines ache. She'd been afraid. She mentioned a man named Grimes who kept to the house at odd hours, and she asked for help quietly, before it's too late. The date on the letter was September 28, 1955. Claire read the letter out loud slowly, like a prayer. When she finished, she looked at Lydia. Why didn't anyone press this? Why wasn't Samuel's case all these names followed up? Lydia's face closed like a book. Records were lost, misfiled, or ignored. History is messy because people are messy. Sometimes it's laziness. Sometimes it's malice. She hesitated. There were whispers back then that Dunwell had a man who liked kids. People talked in corners. They didn't go to the papers. They closed their doors. That should have been enough to set us running to the police. Instead, something quieter took shape. Curiosity braided with dread. Claire wanted to know what had happened to Samuel and the other children. She wanted the ledger and the letters cross-checked, their names traced into time until some thread pulled through to present-day answers. I wanted her safe. I wanted to believe Officer Donovan's patrols could hold whatever was loose. Those wants pulled like a double helix, both true, both incompatible. Marcus started sleeping over more often. He kept Lulu in the driveway and sat at my kitchen table until 3 a.m., trying to talk sense into me. "We should stake out Dunwell," he said one night, rubbing his jaw. "If someone's messing with you, we make a plan, strategize." His voice was all practical tools, flashlights, walkie-talkies, routes. Practicality is a language that helps you feel like you control something that isn't controllable. We organized a small reconnaissance, Claire, Marcus, and I. We would go to Dunwell Row at dusk, walk the perimeter, take photographs, and leave. Simple. The kind of plan that looks good on paper. We told Angela. She brought us thermoses of coffee and refused to come, her jaw tight with worry. Tom Briggs insisted he'd trim any backyard hedges that might obstruct a path. Officer Donovan warned us not to go alone. "If you insist, be careful," he said, and handed me a card with a number that reached him after hours. Dunwell Row at dusk looks like any other forgotten alley until you see the way the light pools in its broken windows. The buildings sit tight to each other, their stoops like teeth. We moved slow, careful not to trip on the roots of old lawns. A single street lamp hummed and threw the shadows long and sharp. Claire held a small flashlight and a camera. Marcus had a crowbar and the kind of nervous grin people use to throw off fear. At a back gate, we found a child's shoe, not new, canvas yellowed, the sole worn nearly through. Beside it, someone had carved initials into a fence post. S.A., the same letters in the ledger. Claire stopped breathing for a full count of 5. The wind pushed and made the call of a distant train sound like a child crying. I wanted to say it was coincidence. Instead, I said nothing. Speech felt cheap in that moment, like throwing coins into a wishing well. We found other things as we walked. A half-burned matchbook stamped with a diner name that no longer existed, a splintered toy soldier with a missing arm, and in one window, a smear on the inside glass that looked disturbingly like a small palm print run through flour. Nothing that would be convincing in a court, perhaps, but all of it threaded together like a story being retold in fragments. When we reached the end of Dunwell Row, near an old cellar hatch, Marcus swore he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping from below. It wasn't wind, it was a child's cadence, light and repeated, as if fingers were running over pipes. We listened until our ears hurt. No one said a word. Marcus tried the hatch. It was locked, rusted shut decades ago. Mouse scratches clung to the wood. On the walk back, a figure stepped from the shadow of a porch. Thin, hunched, the face partly obscured by a hood. My chest slammed. Instinct took command. Claire grabbed my arm. Marcus squared his shoulders. The figure lifted a hand in a motion that might have been a wave, might have been a threat. Then the man, because he seemed a man, though his age was a guess, turned and melted into the dark. We followed at a distance. He moved with a familiar limp, the sort of odd hitch that sticks in the mind. We lost him near an alleyway behind a shuttered gas station. The next day, Tom Briggs told us he'd seen the same man sitting on his porch the week before, whittling something. Tom, a man who knew everyone, said the man didn't belong in Livonia. He had that look like someone who's been somewhere hard, Tom told me, eyes narrow. We should have called him out then. He sounded like a man who'd carried a regret since. That evening, Claire brought home a photocopy of a page from a probate court file. Arthur Grimes, listed as guardian, had been granted control of several properties during the 1950s after a series of mysterious absences. The listing showed Grimes as executor for an estate that vanished from the records in late 1955. The dates clustered like teeth. The more we threaded names through time, the more the pattern looked less like chaos and more like design. But the town had limits to how much it would help us excavate its past. Donovan's reassurances frayed into bureaucratic phrases. "We can open a cold case if there's evidence," he said once, "but you'll need more than sentiment." He was trying to be honest. We tried to produce more than sentiment. Then the harassment started again, but more deliberate. Our porch light was thrown. Wiring frayed, likely tampered with. A note appeared taped to our mailbox. "Just leave." Claire took it down with gloves, her jaw set so hard the skin around it whitened. Marcus set up a cheap camera on the eaves and declared himself our lookout. Someone drilled a small hole in the back of our mailbox and slipped a photograph inside it. A grainy shot of our house from across the street, taken at twilight the week before. On the photograph, in tiny pencil, someone had written, "We found you." When fear presses down, it maps itself across small details. The way streetlights suddenly seem hostile, the inversion of friendly faces into possible witnesses to malice, the way your pillow feels like a trap. I started to sleep in the living room with the television on low, the blue light a poor substitute for company. Claire, who once cataloged other people's histories with a care that made me love her more every day, now cataloged the small, present dangers. Holes in our fence, footprints in the garden, the time a screwdriver was left on our porch like a marker. We were close to pulling something larger out into the open. We felt it the way a miner feels a shift in the rock before a seam breaks. Darker things were moving with us as we moved. The town's past had teeth, but teeth alone are not proof. We needed to find where they had been embedded. That night, just after midnight, Marcus knocked on my window and held up his phone. He'd reviewed the footage from the cheap camera he'd placed on our eaves. The recording showed a shadow moving across our yard at 2:17 a.m., and then another shadow, smaller, slipping behind it. A child's outline, impossibly small and quick, following a man with the same lame gait we'd seen on Dunwell Row. The file saved as 217.mp4. We watched it until the grainy pixels blurred into a thing we could no longer tell if we had seen or imagined. Claire whispered, "Samuel?" We had the picture. Then, a moving, breathless fragment that tied the past to the present in the most concrete way we could manage. It was not evidence for a court, maybe, but it was evidence for us. It was a promise that the story had teeth, and that those teeth had not forgotten how to use them. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The footage, blurry as it was, changed everything. It took Donovan 3 days to take our panic seriously, but once he did, the town leaned in the way towns do when their comfortable story is threatened, quietly, with a clinical sort of curiosity. He got a warrant to search Dunwell Row. We stood on the periphery the morning they brought in forensics, a tow truck with a maze of equipment in back, a pair of solemn detectives in plain coats, and Officer Donovan with his hand on the small of my back like he was steadying a man about to stare into a long-buried thing. The hatch at the end of Dunwell Row that Marcus had tried finally opened with a chemical sigh. The smell that rose up was the kind of thing you only read about in books, damp, old, and full of the collapsed architecture of long years. They found a crawlspace beneath a boarded floor, and in that crawlspace a tangle of toys and old clothes and a rusted metal lunchbox stamped with a diner logo from the 1950s. It wasn't neat. It had the messy accumulation of years. When a detective, soft-spoken, mid-40s, pulled aside an old blanket, he found a small wooden box. Inside the box were letters and a ledger we recognized. The very pages Claire had photocopied at midnight, dry ink that had survived in brittle hands. There was also, impossibly, a single small shoe the same shape as the one we'd seen on Dunwell Row, preserved like a fossil. They widened the search. They found a shallow pit beneath an overgrown lilac bush, with something like a tangle of cloth and bone, not the kind of thing I can write about without a weight in my chest, and a rusted tin with children's names scrawled in a child's hand. The town's past had swallowed children and hid them in the seams. The forensics team moved with a kind of slow, methodical respect for what they were uncovering. Donovan stayed with us for as long as he could that day, pale and tight-lipped. Arthur Grimes, or what was left of the idea of Arthur Grimes, walked into the Livonia courthouse 2 days later like a man folded down to fit. He was older than the photos had suggested, skin like creased paper, hair gone to hoarfrost, and the same box jaw that seemed designed to hide something. He had never left Livonia, it turned out. He had moved into the fringes, where people barely look. He'd been a caretaker, then a handyman, then a name people muttered with the soft, careful distance you use with dangerous animals. He claimed ignorance. "I didn't know," he told the detective, voice brittle as thin ice. "I was a handyman. I hammered nails. I mowed lawns. I didn't see..." The town didn't want to hear that. Grimes's house was searched. Papers were taken. Old neighbors told stories about a man who liked to sit on porches and watch children play, who asked who their mothers were, and then asked again the next week. Someone found a diary under the loose floorboard of a shed, a ledger of sorts with dates and small notations. There was no clean single moment of confession, no neat resolution. But the evidence piled until even the non-believers, the ones who liked tidy explanations, were forced to sit with the history Livonia had refused to admit. One afternoon, a detective called Claire in the museum back room where she sorted donations. He read her slowly. Human remains found, identified in part by dental records, matched to names in the ledger. Samuel Alden was among them. Hearing it, Claire went very still, then let out a sound I will never forget. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, the mingled thing of someone whose grief has finally found a place to anchor. For me, the discovery was a mixture of justice and a kind of sorrow that felt too public. The town had found its child, and with him it found a wound it could no longer hide. Grimes was charged with a series of crimes that rolled like thunder through the town. The trial wasn't fast. The law grinds and grinds until the teeth show. In court, friends and strangers filed in. Claire sat in the front row with Lydia and a handful of people who had, like us, been stubborn enough to keep asking questions. Marcus kept his jaw set like a vice. Tom Briggs sat in the back with the kind of face men wear when they've been given a job that requires them to look brave for others. The prosecution was careful. They didn't try to make the story more grotesque than it was. They told the facts, A pattern of disappearances, unreported oddities, the ledger, the physical evidence found behind the lilac bush. Grimes' defense painted shadows, old age, mistaken identity, a town eager to put blame anywhere. For months, the courtroom became our altar. People took sides, and neighbors who'd once shared pies sat at different tables. I learned a lot about how towns heal, awkwardly, with necessary anger, and with the slow work of making space for truth. In the end, Grimes was convicted on several counts related to the disappearances and the handling of the property. The sentence was something, not everything, but it was something the ledger had demanded. After the verdict, Livonia hummed with a kind of exhausted relief. But relief, I learned, is not the same as peace. It is the first small, cautious step toward it. For us, life didn't snap neatly back into the old rhythm. We had to build new habits, locks that were better, have cameras that actually worked, a community that checked in with one another more than it had before. Claire continued to work at the museum, but she began a project that would take years, a public archive and a memorial for the children whose names had been swallowed by silence. Lydia found funding and donors. Angela baked a cake and offered it at the dedication. Tom gave the speech, clumsy with grief, and Marcus played the guitar outside the small park the town donated for the memorial site. We all came for that opening like pilgrims, and I watched people read names off small brass plaques and cry as if they'd been given permission to mourn. And the house, our house, became, slowly, a place where the nights were quieter. Sometimes in winter, when the radiators clicked and the snow muffled the street, I would find Claire at the kitchen table with a stack of files, the same way she had been when this began. She still kept the photograph of the boy in a drawer near the lamp, but now the drawer also contained letters from parents who had lost grandparents in the years after Samuel's disappearance. They wrote to say thank you, or to say they were sorry, or to offer memories that had been dormant on dusty shelves. There is a part of this story that will not be comfortable. The question of how a community allows harm to nest in its undergrowth. That question doesn't have a single answer. In Livonia, it was a mix of complacency, small-town courtesy that avoided confrontation, and the unwillingness to look right at the messy past because it was easier to pretend it had gone away. But once you pry a hinge, once you open the door, the light spills in, and you are obliged to do something with what you see. At night, I still wake sometimes and hear things. A child's laugh, not cruel but faint and distant, or the soft echo of a lullaby that might be on the radio or in my own memory. They are not threats. They are the residue of a story that touched us and changed us. Claire says those sounds are the town's way of remembering, a small, stubborn insistence that the missing are now, somehow, present. We learned to be a town that could hold its mistakes and punish them. We did not become saints. We became, if anything, more human, clumsy, remorseful, determined to fix things that had been left to rot. And in the quiet moments when the world felt safe enough to breathe, I would play a simple tune on my guitar and think of Samuel and the names on the brass plaques. Sometimes Marcus would sit in the doorway, and we would talk about old days and new ways. Sometimes Claire would bring a new donation and smile with the relief of someone whose work finally mattered in a way it never had before. The world beyond Livonia may forget us, or never have known our name at all. But for those of us who live here, who walked through the dark and then demanded the light, the story stays. It is a warning and a benediction both. Look after the small things, listen to the knocks at 3 a.m, and do not let rumor be the only judge of what is right. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Daniel Mercer, I'm 32, and the date was October 13, 2018. People ask me why I went back to Livonia that week, like returning invited trouble. The honest answer is smaller and meaner. I went because I thought fixing the house would fix me. After a divorce that finished cleanly on paper but left everything else in shreds, I took a job across the state and rented a small, battered bungalow on the west side of Livonia. It was the kind of house that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old smoke, the kind that had a porch swing that sagged in the middle and a basement door that stuck in the summer humidity. I liked the idea of a porch candle and a winter of quiet. I liked the idea of leaving the loud city for streets with maple trees and neighbors who kept to themselves. Before the move, I'd known Livonia only as a stop on a map. Strip malls, quiet cul-de-sacs, a town that didn't try to be anything but ordinary. Once I was there, I learned it had its own small histories. A shuttered factory where teenagers dared each other after dark, a public library with a volunteer who memorized overdue fines, a diner that still served pie from the same two women who'd worked the counter for decades. People said the town was comfortable because it refused to be dramatic. It avoided attention like a cat avoids a bathtub. My roommate for the first month was Travis Lang, a barber who wore his hair like he had a secret handshake with history. A little too tidy at the sides and a tired smile that suggested he'd seen too many exes and too many bad haircuts. Travis had grown up in the next town over, and for a while he taught me the small map of Livonia, which corner store still sold gas at a decent price, which park held the best walnut trees in autumn. We drank cheap coffee on my sagging porch and made plans that sounded like safety nets. Fix the porch, paint the kitchen, stop checking the phone the way someone checks a wound. There were other people too, heartbreaks and anchors. Lena Whitmore, an old flame, called once in September with condolences and then a strange, almost apologetic warning about the neighborhood. Don't leave the basement light off. I laughed with an easy dismissal that masked the little bleed of worry. Neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Ortega, 2 doors down, waved from their driveway as if we were parts of a well-ordered painting. There was a cop named Caleb Monroe who lived up the street and who would sometimes stop and ask about the thermostat when we were outside shivering after a late winter job. He was the kind of cop who made you feel like you were from the same moral script, even when you weren't. There was also the town gossip, Marjorie Finch, a woman who clipped coupons with the precision of a seamstress, and who could tell you who was having an affair and when the local pastor had missed Sunday service. Marjorie told stories the way people passed dishes at family dinners, with a smile and an expectation that everyone would eat. One evening, over her fence, she told me, because after the divorce I became an audience for town history, about the old cranberry farm on the edge of Livonia. She drew the farm like a weathered map in the air. Used to be people there, back before the subdivision and the freeway. Strange things sometimes stick to the soil, she said, as if dirt were a shape memory like an old sweater. I took Marjorie's line with a polite nod and a cold coffee. It made a good story in the way old things make good stories, grainy edges, room for embellishment. But Livonia felt practical, and my life was folded into small practical things, a lease, a job across town, an apartment that needed nails in odd places. I found solace in routine. The first blank wall I painted blue. The second week, I fixed the basement door with a latch I bought from the hardware store on Newburgh Road. By the time October came, the leaves had turned the exact color of nostalgic regret, and the wind moved through the streets like someone trying to be less lonely. Work was a series of nights. I drove home after long shifts and found myself thinking about the basement like a room I owed attention to. People rarely use basements for anything but storage and the hum of the furnace. In our house, the basement was unfinished, the concrete worn like an old coin. There was a window tucked high near the ceiling that let in square slivers of afternoon light on good days, and on bad days the window reflected only the single bulb we kept lit. We started keeping the bulb on more because it made us feel less like trespassers in our own home. Small things become superstitions when you're alone at night. A few neighbors joked, in the way neighbors do, that the house had history. They meant the kind of history that meant repairs and odd drafts, not the cinematic sort. But there were little stitches that pulled at me. A set of initials carved into the back of the basement doorframe, a photograph in a hallway that everyone assumed was of some long-dead relative. The oddness was never malicious. It was more like a person who says something odd and then apologizes. Still, it made me curious in that particular way that can go the wrong direction if you lean too close. My ex-wife's voice came into the house in the shape of bills and the remnants of dinners we'd never finished. That grief made the house a kind of laboratory for loneliness. I kept a small notebook where I tried to catalog what needed doing and where I sometimes wrote observations as if my life were an experiment. October 10th, fixed latch, basement light on, felt less anxious. The notebook's neatness pleased me. It was my small claim on order. The main story begins here, the moment when all that well-ordered smallness refuses to hold. That night, the wind moved through the maples with a patience I hadn't learned to dislike, and the streetlights threw a tired glow on the pavement. I was in the kitchen painting a shelf, thinking about nothing, when the power hiccuped and the basement bulb, the one we'd left on out of habit, blinked and died. It was a small thing. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. It was a small thing, like the kind of small thing that opens the door to larger ones. The bulb died, and the house inhaled a different kind of dark, the kind that fills the corners that daytime forgets. I stood with the paintbrush in my hand and listened as if anything that mattered would announce itself. For a minute there was nothing but the slow domestic music of a place that's merely lived in. The refrigerator's hum, the distant tick of the neighbor's clock through the walls, the wind trying to rearrange the leaves on the porch. Then I heard it. The kind of sound you mistake for something ordinary until your brain refuses the mistake. From down below, the basement, came a soft, deliberate scraping like someone easing a chair along concrete, only slower and with a patience that felt personal. My first sensible thought was that one of the boxes had shifted in the storm of the wind, or that the old furnace had decided to cough up a nuisance. My second, less sensible thought was that I wasn't alone. Travis was out that night. He'd taken a late cut at the barber and left a note on the fridge saying he'd be back around 10. I considered calling him, but the thing about being alone is that the telephone becomes another kind of silence. You listen for it to ring and only hear your own paranoia answering. Instead, I told myself the useful lies you tell in situations like this. It's probably a raccoon. It's probably a neighbor's kid. It's nothing. I went to the basement door anyway because that's what you do when your house speaks in noises you don't recognize. The stairs smelled of damp cardboard and the faint iron of something older. I pulled the door open and the lightless stairwell stared back at me like a throat. My phone's flashlight was a narrow, embarrassed thing against the dark. It picked out dust motes at the edges, the flaking paint on the banister, a set of footprints in the dust that shouldn't have been there. They were small. Too small to be mine, too small for Travis, and shaped in a way that made my mouth dry. Two oval impressions with heel marks, like ballet slippers pressed in plaster. They ran from the bottom step to the far wall where the water heater hummed, and then they stopped, as if the person who had left them had been halted by a rule they couldn't cross. I told myself the rational things, children's shoes, the previous tenant's relics, a prank. But rational things are sometimes scaffolding for the other stuff, and scaffolding collapses when the wind is right. I moved down into the basement. The flashlight carved a path. The house felt larger below, as if the floor above had been built to keep other things contained. The air was colder, and my breath fogged for a moment in the beam. There was the photograph I'd mentioned earlier, a yellowed sepia of a family at the edge of a marsh, lying crumpled near the furnace where it hadn't been before. I recognized the house in the photograph as one of the old cranberry farmhouses Marjorie had told me about. There was a child in the picture with hair like a halo and a small wooden wheel at his feet. My chest tightened. The wooden wheel, an old toy top, sat on a crumbly shelf nearby, the same muted grain and scuffs that would come from being rolled inside for decades. It shouldn't have been in our basement. I picked it up, feeling the cold varnish, and then laughed at myself because the laugh was the same small brittle thing you use to distract a room from its own shuddering. When I turned to go upstairs, there was a sound at the far edge of the basement by the small window that only lets in jealous rectangles of light on good days. A soft, almost conversational tapping like a finger against glass. I walked over, the floorboards creaking in a way that announced me, and I saw prints on the window's sill. Little smudges, as if someone had breathed on the glass from the inside and left the trace. I put my palm against the cold pane. For a second, I thought I felt warmth on the other side. Then the tapping stopped. It was the kind of silence that calls up a memory you didn't know you had. A playground swing stopping mid-arc, a lullaby losing its last note. I walked back to the stairs and felt, absurdly, embarrassingly, watched. The next morning, I told Caleb Monroe, the cop who lived up the street, because the sensible thing to do is sometimes to put the absurd in front of someone who can weigh it without theatrics. Caleb came over, took one look at the small prints and the photograph, and told me, as cops will, both the reasonable parts and the parts designed to keep you level. Old houses have things, Daniel. People leave things behind. Kids play. Maybe someone broke in and left some garbage. He paused, as if considering whether to say the rest. Or someone was here before, and they didn't leave on their own. After Caleb left, we blocked the basement with a spare plank and taped the window as if barricades could make a story stop. That evening, we sat in the living room with 2 beers and a pair of floodlights trained on the yard like questioning headlights. Travis offered to sleep in the living room on the couch, partly to be reassuring and partly because barbers can be practical in a way that looks like heroics. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. And in the morning, I felt a childish relief that the house had, for once, kept its secrets quiet. I wanted it to be over, to go back to painting the kitchen and crossing off items from my neat notebook. But small things compound. That week, a neighbor called to say they'd found a child's shoe stuck under a bench in the neighborhood park. Another neighbor swore they heard a child laugh as they walked past the old cranberry marsh on Newburgh Road. Marjorie knocked on my door with the kind of face that means she'd been collecting details like coins. You should be careful, dear. Things that get buried sometimes want to be found. The town's history, which had felt like background static before, started to present itself as pattern. Old records at the library, the same library where the volunteer seemed to know everyone's overdue fines by heart, told me about a family that had lived on the cranberry farm in the 1940s. There was an obituary for a boy named Tommy Aldridge who had disappeared one autumn and whose case, they wrote, remained unsolved. The descriptions were clinical and cold. The margin notes someone had scribbled in faded pencil read like an argument between the past and the present. Search the marsh, someone had written, and beneath it, no trace. I didn't want to be the kind of person who digs up old wounds for the thrill, but I was also a man living in a house that had made itself notable by rearranging itself into a narrative. I found myself walking the marsh at dusk, the wet ground soft under my boots, the reeds whispering like people in a crowd. The cranberries had been replaced by a subdivision, but the edge of the marsh held its own memory. In the shadow of the development, my flashlight picked up a small wooden wheel half buried in mud, the same grain, the same scuffs. When I brought it back and placed it on the kitchen table, Travis stepped back like it had grown teeth. That came from the marsh? He asked. I nodded. We didn't talk about what it meant. We just sat there and listened to the house breathe. That night, the basement bulb burned uninterrupted, as if nothing at all had happened. But when I opened my notebook the next morning, written in a hand that wasn't mine, small, precise, and almost childlike, were 3 words on an otherwise blank line. Find me now. I dropped the notebook like it had stung. The floodlights went on and we went outside like people fleeing a sudden rain. I told myself the practical explanation, a prank, an elaborate sick joke. But the sight of the wooden wheel on the table and the print on the window and the photograph all lined up made a kind of cold argument that my mind couldn't dismiss. At that point, Livonia stopped being just a map and became a place with a center, a knot where the town's past and the floor of my basement met. I began to learn the difference between things that can be explained and things that demand an answer. And when demands appear in a small town, they find a way to be heard. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The notebook's sudden handwriting broke something inside me. It was the precise, awful kind of thing that makes you check a locked door twice, because locking it once no longer feels like enough. For a long time after I found those 3 words, find me now, we moved around the house like people on a thin sheet of ice. We left lights on in rooms we didn't plan to use. We left the front door unlocked so it looked like someone was home. And we left the radio on low because noise is the polite opposite of empty. Travis tried to keep things light. He trimmed his own hair in the living room and hummed through the gaps of silence, a way of proving to himself that he could. Caleb came by more than once, more in the way friends do than officers, with casseroles, with easy jokes, with the sort of looks that mean, we'll get you through this. Marjorie came by to bring over a pie and to press information into me like a woman leaving breadcrumbs. The library's volunteer pulled out an old town ledger for me and photocopied newspaper clippings until her hands ached. She looked at me when she handed them over, like someone who'd handed over a key she wasn't entirely sure she wanted gone. There were other clues. A list of names in a margin from a 1940s police blotter, a map with a scribbled note about a well that had been filled in near the old cranberry marsh, a grainy photograph of a boy on the steps of a farmhouse. The same boy, almost certain, as the halo-haired child from our basement photo, and the name beneath it, Tommy Aldridge, age 6. Knowing a name makes an unknown into a person, and once Tommy had a name, he started to sit in my day like a small, uncomfortable animal. I couldn't stop thinking about how the town had folded around that absence for decades, like a family folding a flag. Somehow, everyone knew to be quiet about the crease. People had stories with different edges. A sighting at the marsh, a sympathetic farmer who remembered a boy who wandered, a rumor that the Aldridges had left town in the spring after the disappearance, as if removal might outpace grief. One afternoon, as the sky went the color of old coins, Caleb and I walked the edge of the marsh. The reeds were high and moved like slow hands. The ground was softer near the old well marker. My boots sank a little with each step. There's a way marsh air smells that makes time collapse, wet and green and carrying things that don't belong. Caleb pointed out depressions in the ground near a copse of birch, small hollows that a shovel might make. We probed with a stick and found nothing but the cold bite of mud. On the way back, Caleb said something I hadn't expected. "You might not want to dig up that past, Danny. Sometimes people do dangerous things to hide what they keep, or they keep what they hid." He was being circumspect, the way cops learn to be, and I heard in it a worry I recognized because I felt it. Digging makes roots move. That night, the house took a new turn. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of something small and urgent, the kind of noise that wakes you with the sharp taste of fear. It was coming from the living room. I slipped on jeans, grabbed a flashlight, and moved through the house like I'd learned to move, all soft steps and careful breathing. The living room held nothing at first save our shadows and the floodlights painting the curtains. But on the table lay a single red ribbon, looped and knotted neatly, the kind children tie on sticks when spoiling for treasure. On the ribbon was a smear of dried mud, and pressed into its fibers, a smear of something darker that made my stomach turn. Not blood, not at first glance. It could be rust or old soil, but it had the wrong sort of permanence for a thing that should have been harmless. I picked it up with the back of my fingers and put it into an envelope with hands that trembled, even as I kept my voice calm enough to call Caleb. He arrived within minutes, shoes whispering over the porch, breath ragged from the cold, and when he saw the ribbon, his face narrowed into a professional mask. "Danny," he said quietly, "this is a town story. People get caught up in the old. Sometimes it tries to talk back." He could have meant the ribbon. He could have meant me. I wanted to mock him for being vague. Instead, I asked the thing that matters in these moments. What can we do? We called in a favor, the kind of favor you accrue by being a friendly face at every 4th of July parade and by letting the cop next door borrow tools. A local historian, an elderly man named Arthur Bell, who kept his own archive of scrapbooks and had the stubbornness of someone who believes in truth as a physical thing, came over with a lantern and a pair of gloves. Arthur had thin, patient hands and the kind of voice that reads public announcements. He sat at my kitchen table and spread out documents like they were relics. "We always thought he might be buried on the farm," Arthur said, tapping a newspaper column from 1943. "People said the ground was soft near the well, but there was talk then, too, about the Aldridge boy seeing things. People say he stopped, the way people do when superstition tucks itself into a room. Most of the town decided to stop asking." The next afternoon, we went to the old farm lot with shovels and flashlights and the odd conviction that action would ease everything. The subdivision waited like a patient forest of modernity. The developer's sign was rusting. The promised model homes were skeletal frames. We found the area near the well marker and started to dig where the ground felt wrong. That first shovel turned up roots and mud and the sharp smell of old iron. We dug until evening, settled into the marsh like a blanket, and the light turned the dirt the color of dried bones. It was at the edge of dusk, when everything looks like possibility and regret, that the shovel clanged against something that didn't belong. A metal box, small and square, wrapped in leather like it had been meant for a pocket. Arthur unwrapped it with hands trembling only slightly, and inside was a medallion, a wooden toy soldier, and a scrap of cloth with the initials T.A. carved into the leather with a knife. I didn't have to be told who T.A. was. We called the county. They took the box and the items and promised they'd test everything. The news spread through town like a rumor with momentum. People who had been polite before came to the porch with faces that were a mixture of curiosity and old pain. Marjorie stood at the gate and crossed herself the way some people do when a long silence is broken. When the county cruiser left its light in the road and the men in formal jackets talked in low voices at the end of my yard, I felt the house change. The basement lost its softness and the marsh gained a new kind of presence. The town, which had been a flat map of routine, found itself folding toward the point we'd poked. I slept badly that night, if at all, because the idea of an answer arriving is both relief and a knife. Relief because it promises explanation, a knife because sometimes explanations have edges. In the morning, there was a message scratched into the dust on the basement windowsill in letters that were not printed like an adult's and not quite the writing I'd seen in the notebook. It read simply, "Thank you." I should have felt finished. Instead, I felt the wrong kind of relief. A relief that tasted like the calm after a storm that only cleared to show a deeper sky. There was an ache I couldn't name, a worry that what we'd uncovered was only a hinge on a larger door. The county could close cases and mark boxes in logbooks, but a name doesn't always solve what a town keeps. Sometimes a name sets free things that never wanted to be free. That night, as I lay awake, I thought of the little red ribbon that had been placed on our table and of the small haunting things. The toy wheel, the footprints like ballet slippers, the child's hand in a photograph. I realized, with a clarity that felt both like a small salvation and a small doom, that this story had more to tell, not just of what had been buried, but of what had been kept alive in the corners of our lives. If the town would speak, then it would do so in pieces, one at a time, and I would have to listen for each piece. When I closed my eyes, a memory I didn't know I had slipped forward, a faint lullaby, half remembered, a voice that might have been my own or might have been the house's, singing the same two lines over and over. I didn't yet know if the song was a comfort or a summons. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The morning the county took the little leather box away, the street felt like it had been given permission to breathe. Neighbors spoke in clipped, careful tones as if they were walking past an altar. The sheriff promised an investigation, and for a few days, everything smelled faintly of official paper and bleach. People offered condolences the way you hand over a casserole. Practical, heavy with unspoken things. I should have felt finished. Instead, I felt unstitched. The funeral, if you can call it that, for a child whose body we didn't yet have, was small and awkward. The county arranged a marker by the old well after they confirmed the medallion, and the scrap of cloth belonged to Tommy Aldridge. A handful of townsfolk, old and younger, came with hands in pockets, as if touch might break something projective. Marjorie brought lilies and stood by the marker like a sentinel. Arthur read something from a page that he said came from the Aldridge family Bible. His voice cracked on the names as if the sound were heavy. I watched and felt that peculiar mixture. Relief that the town had done something with its memory, sorrow for what it meant to name a loss this late, and a hard, cold thread of guilt for being the one to dig. After the county closed its files and the reporters left, the house settled into a new rhythm. The prints on the basement window vanished, gone as if they'd never been there. The red ribbon disappeared from the mantel after a while, folded up and placed inside a drawer where I sometimes caught the corner of it like a secret. The wooden wheel found a place on a shelf by the kitchen window, a small wooden presence that felt less like proof and more like a talisman. People began to say the right things. Closure, they called it. That the ledger had been balanced and the town could move its attention to the weekly market and the high school football schedule. For many, it did. Life resumed the way water resumes its level when you stop stirring. But some things don't level. Some things keep their own tides. At night, I still woke to the lullaby. It was seldom now, a half-breath of melody at 2 a.m, a line of a song that might have been hummed by a mother or by the house itself. Once, months after the marker was set, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and heard a tiny, delighted giggle across the street, as light and bright as if a child were playing in the yard. Travis, who had moved back to his barber chair and his neat life, shrugged when I told him and said, "Maybe the neighborhood's getting lively." He didn't laugh. He never had my taste for terror. There were other small proofs that the place had not been merely haunted, but hauntedly human. A neighbor found a toy soldier on his doorstep the day after a storm. Someone put a fresh ribbon on the marker without telling anyone. A woman from the library came by with a child's drawing folded into her coat, a crude sketch of a house with a stick figure on the porch and a bright sun labeled simply Tommy. Those acts felt less like echoes of something that had happened and more like repairs, a town making small stitches in a long, thin wound. I wanted to claim some credit for that. I wanted to say that my curiosity had forced an answer. In truth, the town had always known. Perhaps it only needed someone to be willing to look. Maybe that is what a community is, a collection of people who pretend not to see until someone else points at the thing and says, "Look." Sometimes when I stood in my kitchen and watched the light make a rectangle on the floor, I felt Tommy's presence like the warmth of a hand on the back of a chair. It wasn't the malicious press of a ghost in the stories you tell around campfires. It was quieter, softer, a thing that could be tenderness or a trick of the mind. People like to talk about being haunted as if it's a disease you can get and then cure. But absence and memory and the ways they linger are not illnesses. They're human weather. I stayed in the house until spring. The divorce papers had been signed long before Livonia stitched itself back into my life, and in staying I found a kind of restitution. For months I replaced broken boards and painted the dining room the color of early dawn. I planted a small garden where the grass had been stubborn and watched cucumbers creep like small conspirators up a trellis. Friends came and helped and left. Some stayed. The town's rhythms crept back into me like a patient tide. I learned to enjoy the ordinary. I learned to measure a day in simple pleasures. Coffee black as coal, the barbershop gossip, a Sunday drive with the windows down that let the air sweep out the corners of my head. On the morning I finally left Livonia for good, moving west for a job that paid better and promised anonymity, I packed the wooden toy wheel into a box and set it on the passenger seat. I wanted to carry a piece of the place with me without carrying the weight of the whole story. At the last moment, standing on the porch, I ran my hand along the banister and listened for a sound that might say farewell. For a second, the house held its breath, and then the faint, nearly imperceptible tune unfolded from somewhere like a barely remembered nursery rhyme. It wasn't grief. It wasn't triumph. It was the kind of small, private music people make when they feel whole again. I left the house in Travis's care. He promised to keep an eye on things and to water the plants on my porch. The marker at the well remained, and sometimes, often I hope, someone walked by and laid down a bright ribbon or a flower. The town continued in the simple, stubborn way towns do. Small celebrations, bigger silences, lives that insist on being lived. On the road out of Livonia, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the street flatten into the distance like a ribbon. For a while, I thought about turning back. Then I thought about the cup of coffee I'd left half drunk on the kitchen table and the audiobook Travis had been listening to, and I didn't. I don't know what happens to places when people leave. Maybe stories settle and become part of the wood like rings in a tree. Maybe they slip into other people's conversations and morph into something kinder. All I can say, with the arrogance of someone who found a box in the mud and thought that made him a savior, is that some things are not solved so much as folded into the lives around them. Tommy's name is on a marker now. People stop and look. A child sometimes leaves a drawing. The lullaby still comes back like a friend dropping by unexpectedly. If I ever crossed that town again, I would walk to the well and stand in the wind and maybe lay down a ribbon. But for now, I keep the wooden wheel on my desk. When the nights are long and my apartment in another state feels too much like a rented expectation, I take it up and roll it across my palm until the grain smooths. It is a small thing. Small things have a habit of being the last things we need. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Reed. I was 34 years old when it happened, the night that still wakes me in a cold sweat, October 12th, 2019. People in Livonia called that week ordinary. Kids back in school, the maple trees turning, the hum of commuters along Plymouth Road. I lived in a small brick house on Glenway Avenue, 2 blocks from Willowbrook Park, and within walking distance of the old Pinecrest Cemetery that everyone warned children not to trespass in after dusk. My life then felt pinned together by routines. My morning coffee from Ruth's Diner, a route to the suburb small manufacturing plant where I worked as a maintenance tech, and Friday evenings with my girlfriend, Emily Carter, who taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary. Before I tell you what happened that October night, I need to paint who I was and the people around me, because the ordinary is what made the extraordinary so devastating. I wasn't a man of drama. My childhood on the west side of Livonia had been steady. School buddies who'd grown into men who fixed things, family dinners at my mother's house on Sundays, a dog named Jasper who slept with me until he died. People called me dependable. I liked things fixed, predictable. Emily was practical and kind, with a laugh that made everything feel less important than it was. Her parents lived in a ranch house 3 streets over, and they raised her with a careful insistence on community and church bazaars. Marcus Lane ran the hardware store on Farmington Road. He and I knew each other from middle school. He was the kind of fellow who'd lend you a ladder and tell you a joke while you died a little climbing it. Sarah Whitfield, my neighbor, kept a gorgeous garden and a tendency to bring over lemon bars when she thought you were having a hard week. Livonia itself had a rhythm of small-town safety and suburban anonymity. You could drive past the strip malls and see the same faces buying the Sunday paper. People left doors unlocked in summer. Yet, under that familiar surface, there were flinches of history, an abandoned factory off I-96 where kids dared each other to sneak in, a derelict farmhouse east of Merriman that the teens used as a rumor factory, whispers about late-night figures in work boots near the train tracks. The city council would pass ordinances, and life would go on. That is why, when strange things began to move at the edges of my evenings, I thought them quirks of a tired mind, not the beginning of something that would unthread the whole of my life. I worked long shifts. Nights I would come home, toss my boots by the door, and sit on the sagging couch eating leftover lasagna while Emily graded papers. The week leading to October 12th felt heavier. A series of small misplacements, a toolbox left in the yard, my phone inexplicably switched to airplane mode for no reason, and the porch light that buzzed even after I'd replaced the bulb. I blamed stress and shrugged it away. On October 10th, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. Not all is what it seems. No name, no joke. The paper smelled faintly of cedar. I showed it to Marcus over coffee at Ruth's. He laughed it off. Teenagers, someone said, trying to spook you. Sarah suggested I call the police if it bothered me. I didn't call them. I was embarrassed by the notion that someone in our town might toy with me, Thomas Reed, the reliable guy who fixed the busted sink in the community center for fun. There were other small things that week. Jasper, my old dog, did not behave like himself. He paced and refused to sleep in his bed. At work, clocks ran an extra minute here and there, instruments blinking in ways they had never blinked. Emily had dreams, she said, that she couldn't explain, standing at the edge of Willowbrook Park and seeing a man in a hat across the path who would dissolve like fog if she tried to approach him. She told me these things over dinner, and for a minute both of us sat in a silence that tasted like something waiting to happen. If you ask me where the division between my ordinary life and what came after truly is, I would mark it at the exact moment when the world changed its sound. It was on the night of October 12th after midnight when the wind had a tone that didn't belong to wind, a long, low whine like something very old trying to speak through the space between house and sky. I had been alone that evening. Emily had stayed late at school for parent-teacher conferences. I remember the television murmuring a late-night game show, my hands greasy from fixing a busted faucet in the bathroom. The porch light flickered once, twice, and then died. Jasper began to growl, a deep, slow sound that vibrated through the linoleum. There was a shadow beyond the lace curtains of the living room window, but the street was empty when I peered through. My heart ticked faster, a mechanical thing trying to match the quickness of the sudden unease. Then the knock came. Not the polite, neighborly knock, but 3 heavy raps as if someone wielding a mallet stood at the door. The sound itself felt wrong, muffled and vast all at once, like it had been hammered from the other side of a glass universe. I froze. Jasper's hackles rose. I remember thinking, absurdly, of all the small-town horror stories, a late-night stranger seeking help, a prank, a wrong house. I opened the door with my hand on the deadbolt, the chain still latched. Nobody was there. Only a single shoe, muddy and turned inward, lay on welcome mat. A child's shoe, too small for Jasper's size or mine. It was clean in places and smeared with dark, dried mud in others. I bent to pick it up, half expecting someone to leap out laughing, but the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of the maple tree outside. As I held that shoe, something shifted in the night. Across the street at the top of Glenway, a figure stood under the sodium light like a statue. At first I thought it was Marcus, out for a cigarette. But the figure stood absolutely still, arms at its sides, head tilted down. No breath clouded the air. It was as if the person were a silhouette, cut from something colder than darkness. I don't remember making the choice, whether it was a foolish courage or a desperate need to solve the riddle, but I stepped outside and walked up to the figure. My breath puffed in front of me, sharp and visible. Up close, the person, if the word person fits, had no face I could name. The hat it wore cast a shadow so complete that it ate whatever features lay beneath, and the collar of a coat rose high, swallowing the line of the neck. It was not a person from our town. There was something wrong in the angles of its shoulders, something too narrow, too precise. It turned toward me. It did not speak. It didn't need to. The air changed, and a sound, not quite a voice, but a set of vibrations low in my chest, hummed through me. I felt, with a clarity that will not leave me, that something had come home in Livonia that night. The shoe in my hand was heavy as a stone and warm. I smelled cedar again and decay. Behind the figure, through the thin strip of sky visible between the roofs, the moon bent into a grin I could not explain. That, I tell you, was when the story stopped being about misplaced notes and porch lights. That was when it began to be about the scraping at the fragile edges of what we call normal, a scraping that would not leave us alone. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I thought the night ended when I closed the door and cradled that tiny shoe in my palms. But nights, I learned, were only the beginning for whatever had come to sit beneath Livonia's street lamps. I carried that shoe to the kitchen and set it on the counter like a relic I refused to worship. Jasper whined and planted his head on my knee, watching me with eyes that had seen too many winters. I tried to sleep, but the house felt rearranged around a presence I could not see. The next morning, Marcus dropped by with a six-pack under his arm and a face that tried too hard to be casual. "You okay, man?" he asked, as if we'd both not been living the same strange hour. He picked up the shoe, turned it over, and said, "Kid size, huh? Did you have kids over?" He had the kind of laugh that could make something awful feel like a hangover. I wanted to tell him everything, the hat, the way the moon grinned. But instead I told him the note smelled like cedar and that I had found a single child's shoe on my mat. He shrugged. Probably kids messing about. Someone's up to a prank. By afternoon, the prank had a ripple. On social media, a neighbor posted a picture of a shoe on their stoop. Another friend from church said he'd found a pair of mud-smeared footprints in his yard at dawn. Someone started a private message thread that grew like mold. People laughed nervously. This guy tagged teenagers, joked about kids doing urban exploration. Yet if you scrolled far enough, you found the comments from people who were not laughing at all. Someone named Margaret Calloway left a note about a thing called the warden that locals use to whisper about. I messaged her. Margaret ran the Livonia Historical Society, a small brick building with a front window full of sepia photographs and brittle newspapers. She was elderly and had the fierce clarity of someone who'd spent a life turning over the past. She did not laugh when I told her what I'd seen. Instead, she invited me to sit among boxes of documents and fed me tea that tasted of cloves. "We don't use that word anymore," she said quietly, "but it's the closest we have. Folks called it the warden because it watched the town like one who keeps an account." She told me of an old children's home on the outskirts of Livonia, long gone, that had been closed after a fire in the 1930s. The home had housed orphans and wayward boys, and the owner, a man named Abner Whitlock, was said to discipline them in a way that frightened neighbors. Whitlock died before indictments could be made. The home burned a year later under mysterious circumstances. After that, she said, some children vanished, some were adopted quietly, and some families left town under hushed roofs. "Places remember," she said. "People like Whitlock keep accounts they never finish. Sometimes whatever's left wants to finish the book." Margaret's stories did not make the thing any kinder. If anything, they gave it language. A name lets you picture something, and a picture lets you believe you can face it. I felt braver hearing the name, and yet braver is not always safer. That night, the house awakened to a sound like chairs scraping in the attic. At first, I thought it was the wind, then a slow, steady tapping began, a rhythm that settled under my ribs. I rose and found the clock in the hall had stopped at 12:17. My phone displayed messages from Emily. She'd left school early, she wrote. The custodian had called her classroom to say the lights had flickered and that students reported a shadow by the window. A student was missing from class. The message stopped there, letters uncompleted as if her thumbs had frozen. I drove to Lincoln Elementary like a man who'd swallowed a hot coal. The parking lot smelled of cold metal and the leftover tang of cafeteria lemon. Parents clustered near the main door, faces lit by phone screens. The principal, a woman named Denise Harlow, met me with eyes raw from lack of sleep. "He's not gone," she told me. "He wasn't in school this morning." I felt my stomach hollow out and then slam into my spine. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I started to see patterns like cracks spreading through tile, the single shoe on my mat, the footprints, the child's absence in a classroom. The town's ordinary surface was loosening. Denise mentioned others. An elderly man who swore someone knocked on his back door in the night and left a child's drawing on the step. A baker who found a row of tiny handprints in flour on his counter at dawn. I wanted to call the police and stamp my foot until they could not ignore the map of weirdness. I did call. They were kind but polite. "We'll log the report. No sign of forced entry? Any surveillance?" The words were helpful and hollow. Officers came, took statements, and left with gentle reassurances that made the edges of my fear shimmer instead of settle. People here prefer explanations that make sense. For days we tried to insist on sense, but whatever had come to Livonia did not care for our calendars or our logic. It collected small things, shoes, drawings, the minutes on clocks, like a ledger. The more it took, the more persistent it became. Sleep became a stranger. I found myself awake at odd hours looking out the kitchen window, searching for the silhouette under the sodium light. Jasper stopped eating. Emily began to have the same dream she'd told me about. A man in a hat at the edge of Willowbrook, his mouth a thin crescent that looked wrong on any face. She would wake weeping, hands pressed to her mouth as if to seal out a sentence she could not finish. The town offered platitudes. It's stress, that's not real, and I accepted them like bandages that would not hold. At the hardware store, Marcus slammed a toolbox down and said, "You need to do something, Tom." He looked at me with something like fear and something like resolve mixed. "We'll go to Pinecrest," he said. "That's where things began for you, right?" Pinecrest Cemetery sounded as ordinary as any map dot, but at night graves are not dots. They are places where the past breathes. We walked there with flashlights and no small amount of bravado. Among the headstones, the light from our torches fell on dates and names, on lichen and on a carved willow. We found a cluster of small shoes lined on a low mound, a child's shoe like mine, a tiny sandal, a scuffed sneaker, all arranged with terrible, meticulous care. The air tasted of cedar again and something older, burnt sugar, iron. Marcus swore and backed away. "This is wrong, man," he said. "This is wrong. I should have left then. Leave the shoes to whatever account they were keeping. but instead I picked one up. The moment my fingers closed on the leather, the world tilted. A wind rose that smelled of old pages. The ground thrummed with a sound like 100 people sighing at once. Somewhere behind us, beyond the willow and the slab markers, a figure stepped forward from the dark, hat-tipped, shoulders too narrow for any coat I'd seen in town. It did not walk like a man. It moved like a shadow inclined toward you. When it spoke, or when sound found a shape, it did not use words I could hold. It threaded images into my skull, a ledger full of names, hands writing and erasing, a house that remembered screams as paint remembered sun, a child's laughter recorded like a sound on a tired phonograph, playing slower and slower until it warped. I fell to my knees, gripping shoes that were suddenly hot and beating with a pulse that was not mine. Marcus dragged me away. We ran, and later I could not explain why my feet carried us through backyards so fast. I thought about calling the police again, about a dozen practical things people whisper when nightmares could be treated like plumbing problems. But when I reached for my phone, it showed a dozen missed calls from Emily and one unread text. Don't let it take everything. I began to understand, not with logic, but like a slow infection, that whatever this was, it collected tokens. Tokens to bind us, to map us. And once it had a map, it could read us like an account book. We were not merely being watched, we were being accounted. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. They started locking their doors then, not the casual, neighborly latch of summer, but the hard turn of deadbolts, the kind you use when you believe someone might be waiting on your porch with patience in their pockets. Livonia changed in a week. The corner bakery closed early. Churches held extra vigils. The local news ran a story about unexplained disturbances between school dismissals and midnight. People called it everything from a prank to mass hysteria. No explanation fit the shape of what was happening. Emily stopped sleeping in our bedroom. She would sit on the stairs and stare at the hallway as if waiting for someone to walk through. Marcus slept with a hatchet under his pillow. Sarah stopped tending her garden and started carrying a satchel full of salt and a rosary she had not used since she was a girl. You could feel the town shrink inward, as if we were all trying to make ourselves smaller so the thing that kept accounts would overlook us. I refused to be overlooked. Margaret gave me a box the day after we found the shoes in Pinecrest. It was heavy and smelled of dust and cedar, lined with brittle newsprint. Inside was a ledger, a real ledger, bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed and finely inked in a practiced hand. Names were written in a tiny, patient script, each crossed out with a different ink when the account was settled. There were dates that did not make sense and margins annotated with shorthand I could not parse. At the back of the book, someone had scraped away the paper until the underlying board showed through. And there, faint as old frost, were the words, "Keep what is owed." Margaret said little else. Her eyes were small, hard beads that had cataloged people longer than most of them had been alive. "It keeps a ledger," she said, "but it isn't a book you can burn, not truly. Burning a ledger only makes the ash a ledger for the air." She put her hand over mine like a benediction or a warning. "If you take a thing from it, sometimes it borrows something of yours. Balance, Thomas. Balance is what it taught them." Balance translated into a pattern. Things taken were matched by losses of other sorts. Clocks skipped minutes while pets grew quiet, names disappeared from school lists, while a family picture found a smear that could only be described as a handprint. Whoever, whatever we were dealing with did not demand a ransom in money. It collected tokens and paid them in the currency of our lives. Emily went to the children's home ruins 3 nights after Margaret's visit. She said she had to know. She took a flashlight and the ledger under her arm like a talisman. I asked to go. She kissed my forehead and said, "You need sleep, Thomas. You can't fight everything." She closed the door and I listened to the tick of the old radiator until it sounded like a metronome counting down. When she did not return, the town's small talk evaporated. Denise Harlow organized searches. Marcus and I drove to the ruins with a shovel and a crowd of parents whose faces looked older than their years. The house that had once sheltered discarded children was a field of blackened beams and half-sunken foundations. Moonlight made the jagged wood look like ribs. Someone had nailed toys to a broken porch column in a macabre display, little bodies frozen mid-gesture. We found Emily's scarf caught on a splinter of wood. Her notebook lay open, the pages flapped by a wind that smelled like smoke and sugar. The ledger was gone. I should have collapsed. Instead, my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the shovel. People shouted. Denise cried. Marcus swore until his voice broke. A line of footprints led from the house toward the old service road and then nothing, as if the earth had decided to stop keeping track beyond a certain point. After that, the thing stopped being just something that visited. It moved into our days. It painted small, private wounds across the town. A father found his son's drawings turned into maps of unfamiliar streets. A woman woke and spoke in a child's voice for an hour, telling strangers about rooms no longer standing. At night, I dreamed of shelves lined with shoes and pictures, each item a bead threaded on a wire leading to a face I could not quite see. The ledger had names and numbers, and according to Margaret, a way to read them. If you could match a token to an entry, you might bargain for what it kept. We tried bargaining. Marcus and I stole back 3 shoes from a display on an abandoned stoop. We laid them on my kitchen table and tried to coax the ledger, which I had eventually recovered from an old filing cabinet in Margaret's office, where she had hidden it, into giving up a line that matched them. I read the tiny script over and over until the letters blurred. There were names I recognized, names of kids who had gone missing decades ago, and next to them faint ledger marks that looked like tally strokes. Somewhere in the margins, an ink blot looked like a key. At 2 a.m, when the house was small with only Jasper's breathing to measure it, I heard a sound like a pencil dropped on concrete. A single patient knock. The doorway held a dark I wanted to call human, and in that dark, a child's silhouette. Hands, too many hands, pressed against the glass of the window like places where fingers had been stuck and could not be pulled free. I opened the door. Emily stood there, her face pale as milk, a smear of something dark at the corner of her mouth. The scarf was in her hand, sticky with a residue I could not name. She looked like someone who had been reading terrible things and decided the next page might be worse. She said one thing. It asked for balance. She reached for me, and in that instant, every clock in the neighborhood went mad. They spun wildly and then stopped. Jasper yelped and then was silent. The ledger flared on the kitchen table like an animal roused. We tried bargaining out loud, the way children bargain with a parent leaving for work. Take this shoe, I said, offering one of the stolen tokens. Take my watch. Take my name. Take anything but her. It listened as a presence listens, then tilted like a deaf thing made polite by procedure. The air around us thickened, and the writing in the ledger squealed like someone scratching with a nail. A line that had been crossed out reappeared, fresh ink bleeding through the page. Emily's eyes rolled back. She began to recite things in voices that were layered and wrong, names of people I knew and names I did not. She spoke of Abner Whitlock in a child's sing-song, and then of a girl named Lisa May, who had been 9 in 1933. I tried to shake her awake and felt a heat like a brand on my palms, where my skin met hers. She slipped away from me as if through a door I did not see. The ledger's page tore itself free, and the air smelled of cedar and burning paper. When she finally collapsed, the ledger lay open to an entry with our street address on it, and a new mark that was not there before, a single vertical stroke that had not been crossed out. Margaret told me later that such a mark in the old accounting meant owed. That night I lost more than a person. I lost sleep. I lost the brittle faith that logic could untangle this. I lost the casual conversation with neighbors. I lost Jasper 2 weeks later to a silence that came for him in the night and did not leave. I woke to find him still in his bed, eyes open but seeing something else, and then gone. The grief was a currency too. I also began to lose pieces of myself, not physically, but memory by memory. At times I would stand in my living room and not remember how I had come to own the ledger. I would glance at a photograph and momentarily not know the faces. Names slid like fish through my hands. I wrote everything in a notebook and hid it under the loose floorboard by the stove, and when I looked later, the pages were blank as river stones. If the ledger took things to balance its accounts, then perhaps the only way to beat it was to understand the book. That took me back to the ruins, into places people tried not to walk at dusk, and into the cold ledger margins where someone had written in a different ink, "Return what you cannot bear to lose." I did not know what that meant the night the figure came to my door and asked for something I could not see named. I only knew that when it asked, it did so with a gentleness that felt like a promise. I understood, with a clarity that hurt, that whatever bargain I made next might cost me pieces I could not imagine giving. I pulled on my boots and opened the door to the night, to the street lamp and the way the snowless October air seemed to hold its breath. The figure stood there, hat low, coat collar up, waiting like a bookkeeper at a ledger I had no right to read. The town behind me slept in fits and starts. The ledger in my hand felt heavier than the world. "You can make it right," it said, not with words, but with a pressure in my chest, like a hand pressing on a wound. "You can return what's owed." I raised the ledger like an offering, and the street replied with a sound like a bell struck and muffled. Behind the figure, the train tracks hummed a note that hinted the town's bones were opening. I stepped forward. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I stepped forward, and the street answered like a drumbeat. The figure waited as if it had all the time in the world, which, I suppose, it did. The hat hid whatever eyes there were, and where the face should have been was only the empty calm of something that does not age. My palms ached from holding the ledger like an altar. The pages fluttered, though there was no wind, and the black ink looked alive, as if the names themselves breathed. "You can return them," I told it, "because once you name a wish in a place that keeps accounts, everything bent toward that naming. Take me. Take anything. Just bring Emily back. Bring them back." It tilted its head, a motion too smooth to be human. I felt suddenly that it could see every miscounted item in Livonia. The shoe on my mat, the footprints on Mrs. Calloway's lawn, the drawing nailed to a doorframe, and I felt my own ledger entry open inside its pages. A bargain is never a single thing. The ledger unfolded 1,000 small choices between the tick of heartbeats. I watched as ink seeped across paper and formed a phrase in a language older than ours: balance. Underneath was a list, names, tokens, dates, and at the bottom of the list was my name, Thomas Reed, written neat as a ledger line, and then, in a stroke of fresh ink, a price. The price was peculiar and specific, not money, not days, not blood. It wanted weight measured in memory and presence. It asked for my being in the way a town asks for taxes, regular, ongoing, invisible until you miss it. It asked that for every life returned, a piece of me would be set against the account and be kept until the balance was satisfied. It asked that I be the place where debts are recorded and remembered, that I carry them so others need not. I thought of Emily in the ruins, scarf torn, the ledger gone from her arms. I thought of Jasper slipping away into silence. I thought of Marcus and his hatchet, Margaret with her tea and clove-scented hands, Denise kneeling in a school hallway with a child's jacket clutched to her chest. The town, my town, had been pulled into a ledger not of numbers but of small lives. "Make me its keeper," I said, the words falling out like coins. "Take my name if you must. Take my memories. Let them go." There was a sound like pages turning, and then the figure stepped forward. Up close, I could see that what passed for a face was a map of old scars and ledger ribs. It reached toward the book in my hands, not with fingers, but with something like patience. The ink bled one more time, and the ledger opened to a clean page. The figure touched the page where my name was written, and the letters dissolved like breath on a mirror. I felt something inside me loosen, a rope untying. Names I'd carried for years blinked out. The scent of coffee at Ruth's Diner slipped like a memory from my fingers. Jasper's weight on my knees when he was a pup evaporated into a small ache that could not be named. Faces that had been as solid as stone looked like sketches smudged by rain. The ledger swallowed them quietly, and in return, somewhere across town, a child's cry cut the night and then was answered by a mother's voice. Emily walked up the path toward my house as if she were a person walking out of sleep. Her hair was tangled and her face pale, but she was whole. Marcus ran into her arms and sobbed. Denise found a child behind a hedge and held him like breath given back. Over the next hours, the town stitched itself together in the simple, miraculous way towns do when the thread of ordinary unravels. Neighbors brought blankets, people cried and laughed in the same breath, and someone started a pot of coffee that tasted like hope. They forgot, as towns do. The ledger's work is tidy. What is balanced is quieted. Parents found their children again, and later, at coffee, they shrugged about the missing shoes as a prank. Margaret returned the ledger to the Historical Society with hands that trembled less than mine even then. She set it under old papers and told herself it would not be needed again. People resumed their routes to work. Willowbrook hummed with kids on bicycles as if nothing had happened. Only I remembered. The ledger had not taken me wholly. It could not take a man's conscience the way it took photographs, but it had taken the hard things, the little hours you tuck away to call up later. I woke some mornings not knowing if I had always been Thomas Reed or whether that name had been something I picked up in a grocery aisle. Faces I loved looked right at me and sometimes did not fit into the smooth film of memory. Emily came to the door one afternoon and stood there looking at me like a stranger who used a familiar name. She said, "Do I know you?" And the question landed like a stone. "It's me," I wanted to say. "It's Thomas." But the part of me that could say that, really say it from the inside out, had been paid into the ledger and set aside. So I said simpler things. "We used to sit on this porch. I fixed your sink one winter," and Emily smiled politely at the man who seemed kind enough and invited me in out of neighborly habit. To the town, I became a neighbor they liked, but whose story never quite reached their lips. Marcus and I still mowed our lawns, still borrowed tools. Margaret visited the Historical Society less often, but when she did, she pressed a box of old newspaper clippings into my hands and said, "Keep this, just in case." Denise ran school programs with a fiercer gentleness and would sometimes look at me as if deciding whether to ask an awkward question and then would steer away. At night, I walked to Pinecrest. The ledger sits heavy in my lap, and when the moon is right, open it and read the lines I can still see. The ledger keeps its accounts, but now it is in my care, not in the sense that I own it, but in the sense that I am the thing that listens to the town's small debts. I write small, private entries. The name of a dog that died down the street, the date a porch light went out and a child's shoe turned up 2 blocks over, the names of people who ever asked for help and were given it. In exchange, memories not of public matter, but of private warmth. My mother's hands folding napkins, the exact shade of Emily's laugh, are thin and frayed in my head. Names blur at the edges. I hold on the best I can. People call me dependable still. They bring casseroles when someone is ill. They nod and say hello. But there is a quiet distance in the way they remember me, a polite list of facts instead of the layered recall of a life shared. When they tell the story in coffee shops years from now, they will say things like, "There was that season when odd things happened in Livonia. You remember? Well, Tom fixed it. He handled the ledger. The ledger is my burden, and my name has become a shorthand. I do not say I regret the bargain. I think of Emily sometimes in the old way, before the ledger took its price, and the ache is sharp, but she laughs and the town sleeps easy again. If you ask me if I would do it again, I think yes. I would trade my name for a child's life every day. There are things worth being a ledger for. Tonight, when the maple trees outside my house shift and the streetlight hums, I set the ledger on my kitchen table and write another small line. The ledger wants balance. It will always want a tally. I am patient. I have become patience. If this is a true story, and that is what I tell people when they lean in and ask, eyes wide with the sort of hunger that keeps a town alive, then know that sometimes the price of saving a place is being the thing that remembers its cost. If you walk by Pinecrest and find a set of shoes laid on a stone, perhaps leave them be. Perhaps leave them as a warning. Perhaps leave them as an offering. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Daniel Porter. I was 28 years old that night, October 12th, 2019. You should know first that Livonia doesn't announce itself with neon signs or dramatic alleyways. It's a place of maple-lined streets, strip malls that try to look new but never quite do, and houses with porches that creak in the same way every autumn. I grew up a few towns over but moved back after my parents died. I took a night job at a small industrial park on the edge of town. Maintenance and janitorial work for a company that made industrial adhesives. The building sat where Livonia blurred into the old farmland. One side fenced and clean, The other side, a tangle of scrub, drainage ditches, and a long, narrow canal people called Mill Run. Folks whispered about Mill Run when they'd had a few beers. Mostly playful stuff. Rumors of a drowned dog here, a rusted bicycle there. Nothing real. Nothing that would have prepared me. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me tell you who was around me. There was Tom Bennett, my immediate boss, a soft-spoken man with a laugh that came out like a tired sigh. He kept to himself and carried 2 cigarettes in his shirt pocket, even though he only smoked at home. My best friend then was Ethan Mallory, a long-faced comedian of a guy who worked the day shift at the same plant. He liked to call the industrial park Livonia's Forgotten Mall. Marjorie Lane lived across from the plant in a white bungalow with a porch swing she never used. She was the sort who knew the town's gossip and kept everything feeling small and human. My apartment was behind a rundown laundromat on Farmington Road, cheap, drafty, and close enough to walk to work at 11 p.m. The season was changing. October in Michigan has a smell. Wet leaves, cold gutters, and the metallic tang that comes before the first frost. For weeks before the incident, people in town had been talking about the factory on Ridgeview being sold, about construction jobs, and about teenagers with flashlights sneaking into derelict storefronts after midnight. I heard those rumors, nodded, and kept sweeping. Night work has a rhythm. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant thump of trucks on the highway, the steady scrape of a broom. It makes you feel like you own the quiet. It makes you mistake routine for safety. My sister... Well, I don't have a sister. I had a mother and father who loved me and a set of neighbors with small kindnesses. My relationships then were simple. Ethan, Tom, and the plant. I was dating a woman named Laura for about 6 months, practical, tattooed, and honest enough to tell me when I was being reckless. She used to joke that working nights gave me nocturnal instincts, that I could sense the groan of the building like an old animal. She didn't laugh the week before October 12th when I told her about the smell. 3 days prior, I noticed a putrid scent the moment I pushed open the loading dock doors. We chalked it up to a chemical spill. Tom called it old solvent and said management would handle it. But the smell lingered in my clothes for hours after my shift and sometimes crawled under my skin when I slept. Marjorie mentioned seeing shadows near Mill Run one morning, and Ethan said he'd heard kids in the woods who weren't there. You file those things away. People in small towns turn peculiar events into stories and then into a comfortable myth. We do it because it keeps the world explainable. The night everything tilted fell on a Saturday. The plant was quiet. Most of the machines were shut down for maintenance, and only a skeleton crew was on site. I was alone in the West Wing, scrubbing the epoxy floor beneath a row of shuttered offices. Time moves odd at night. Minutes stretch, then snap. At roughly 1:17 a.m., my phone lit up with a message from Laura, a simple call me. But the connection was spotty, so I promised to call once I left. I remember thinking how small my life was. Coffee thermos, heavy boots, keys that jingled like a small choir. At about 1:43 a.m., when I was halfway done with the West Wing, the power flickered. The fluorescent strips buzzed and then hissed back to life. But the lights in the corridor outside the janitor's closet stayed off, leaving a pool of dark. I shrugged, flipped the big industrial lights back on, and kept working. The building noises settled back into their familiar chorus. The HVAC wheeze, the distant clock tower from town chiming what sounded like a wrong hour for a place where hours stopped meaning anything. I should have noticed the silence after the flicker, the hum that never fully returned, an absence that felt like a held breath. The first real sign that night that something had changed wasn't a noise, but a small detail. The broom I'd set against the locker room wall had been moved. Not by much, maybe the width of a palm, but enough to make my skin gooseflesh. I told myself I'd left it that way. I told myself a coworker had been in. I told myself 1,000 small lies. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't footsteps typical to this place, not the clank of work boots or the shuffle of maintenance shoes. These were light, almost tentative, like someone walking in socks, but they carried a cadence that made the tiles underfoot sing in a higher register. They came from the service corridor that led to Mill Run, the area we avoided after dark. I stood very still and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. After 700 words, the story turns. The footsteps outside the door didn't stop because a person had paused. They stopped because whatever was making them had found the seam between two tiles and paused there as if listening for the echo of our building. I went to the door and peered into the corridor. At the very end, where the chain link fence met the shadow of the old loading ramp, a shape hunched. Not quite human, but dressed in something that borrowed from human clothing. A jacket frayed at the sleeves, a face too pale in the shard of moonlight that slipped through a high window. It didn't look up. It just tilted its head, listening to the hum of the lights through the wall. My first instinct was to run. Then, stubborn and stupid, I reached for my phone. No signal. The thing stepped forward in a manner too deliberate to be a child's game. It moved closer, and when it reached the strip of light beneath the door, I saw its eyes. A dull, clinical reflection as if its sight came not from lenses, but from the gloss of a wet surface. A voice, not words at first, but a soft, surge-like noise, brushed the other side of the door. It sounded like paper being folded in a room full of size. I slid the bolt on the janitor's door, heart hammering like something trying to flee. The shape outside the window pressed its face to the glass. It left no breath fog, no condensation, nothing human. My knees chose then to fail me with an animal inevitability. I remember thinking, in that instant of breathlessness, of Marjorie's porch swing, of Ethan's jokes, of Laura's tattoos. I remember thinking of being 28 and surviving things without knowing you were surviving. I don't know how long I crouched, listening. The thing outside walked away. The echo of its footsteps receded into the dark toward Mill Run, toward the canal as if pulled. I opened the door a crack, and there, taped to the outside of the metal frame, was a single scrap of paper with a childlike scrawl. "See you at the bridge." I pocketed the paper like it was evidence and like it was a talisman. The night's temperature felt colder, closer to bone now. I unlocked the door, stepped into the corridor, and for the first time felt the town that raised me like someone else's memory. I walked toward the loading ramp and, in the shallow light, caught sight of prints in the dust. Small, bare, like those made by wet feet. They led down the access road to the edge of the plant and then vanished into the rusted brush that bordered Mill Run. I turned and ran back to my truck, the wood of the loading ramp under my palms slick with a cold sweat. The engine hesitated when I started it, coughing like an old man with a bad heart. I drove with my lights on full and my window cracked, because I thought, absurdly, that if it could hear me breathe, it might be dissuaded. As I pulled out onto Ridgeview, a figure stood in the distance on the small pedestrian bridge that arched over Mill Run. A silhouette thin against the black, hands on the rail, looking down at the water. I honked. The figure did not move. I slowed to a stop, got out of the truck, and walked back despite the knot in my throat. As I approached, the figure turned slowly. It wasn't a face I recognized. It was pale, yes, but the eyes were the same dull, wet reflection I'd seen at the window. Before I could shout a warning, the figure smiled. It wasn't joyful. It was a folded expression that knew something I didn't. That smile was the last sane thing I remember before the bridge gave a sound like an animal in the deep, and the air filled with a noise that was not quite a laugh and not quite wind. I stepped backward. Something cold and wet brushed my ankle. I looked down, and there, crawling from beneath the bridge's railing, were more of those small prints, trailing along the concrete like a child's footprints leading into the dark. I turned and ran back to my truck. I fumbled with my keys like a man in a fever dream and drove away at a speed that felt like sacrilege for a place I thought of as safe. The road behind me was empty when I looked in the rear view, but for the smear of a shape standing still beside the bridge, hands folded as if in patience. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my truck until dawn, watching Mill Run like a man guarding a secret. The town woke and everything looked normal, as if the night had never happened. School buses, coffee shops, and a jogger nodding hello. But the scrap of paper was still in my pocket, and the memory of those eyes sat like a stone in my chest. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I tell you now what came after that first night, because the town wore its normal face, and the dark kept its own. Dawn in Livonia is a careful thing. Light slips between maple branches and makes patterns on porch steps. People tie shoes and check locks and move through routines that convince them the world is unbroken. I tried to fold myself into that pattern. I pretended to work, to sweep the same floors, to laugh at Ethan's stupid jokes. But everything I touched seemed to carry a thin film of cold, like the trace a window leaves on a winter morning. I told Laura the whole story the next day in the laundromat parking lot, the air still smelling faintly of the plant's solvent. She listened, arms folded against the chill, eyes hard but kind. "Danny," she said, "maybe someone's messing with you. Kids, some prank. You know how people are." I wanted to accept that easy explanation. I wanted to believe in ordinary mischief. Instead, I handed her the scrap of paper, "See you at the bridge," and watched her face go slack with the kind of worry that makes you too honest for comfort. Word travels faster in a small town when the thing traveling is fear. By Sunday, someone had posted a picture of the bridge on the neighborhood forum with the caption, "Creepy bridge alert." Kids aren't safe anymore. People argued in the comments like it was politics. One side citing trespassing teens, the other claiming paranormal nonsense. Sheriff Reynolds, a man with a sheriff's badge that looked grandfathered in from a different era, came by the plant Monday morning because Tom had insisted. Reynolds was practical in that way some small-town lawmen are, practical and exhausted. He asked a few polite questions, made a show of sweeping the walkway with his flashlight, and then told me to file a report if anything else happened. He didn't laugh, but he didn't promise to do anything either. That silence from the grown-ups tightened the knot in my chest. So I did what I should not have done. I started looking myself. Ethan and I went back to the bridge the following night. He came because he hated being alone with the idea that his friend was unwell, and because, as he kept saying under his breath, he liked to call things out when they were hiding. We carried 2 flashlights, a length of rope, and the kind of bravado that smells like fear when you get close. The air was the kind that presses its teeth against your throat, raw and small. Mill Run flowed black beneath the bridge, mucus and slow, reflecting the moon like a coin someone had wiped clean. At the far end of the bridge, we found something small and ordinary. A child's plastic horse, faded and slime-slick at its hooves, stuck like a relic at the lip of the railing. Its paint was scored with tiny marks, almost like someone had tried to tally time on its flank. Beside it lay damp, charcoal strokes on a piece of cardboard, a crude drawing of a bridge and a body of water, and a small stick figure standing on the railing with a second figure reaching up from the water. The strokes were childish. The message beneath read, "Come play." Ethan laughed then. A sound that was all jagged edges. He insisted someone had left a Halloween prank early. The laughter left him when a voice answered from the dark below. A tiny, high thing, impossibly close to what you'd expect to hear if a child called for its mother. "Danny," it said. And the name was wrong in a way that made my bones feel like they were being measured for a coffin. The voice came from the water itself, or so it seemed, and it mimicked my voice the way a broken radio mimics a song you used to love. We shone our lights into the canal. The beam struck a surface that should have only reflected moonlight, but instead it looked like someone had painted the water with faint faces. Faces blinked when our light hit them. Not full faces, mind you, but the smudged suggestion of eyes and mouths, pressed just beneath the surface as if the river had become a pane of glass behind which someone watched. Something tugged at the rope Ethan had been letting trail over the side as a joke. It wasn't a violent yank, more like a polite insistence. The rope hummed in my grip and then slackened as if whatever had pulled it had let go. Below, the water settled with a soft sucking sound. The childish voice sang, "Come closer." Ethan swore and grabbed my arm. "We get out of here," he whispered. He tried to make a joke about kids in the woods. He tried to exhale like it was nothing. He didn't want to believe it either. We left the horse and the drawing on the railing, like leaving a breadcrumb you hope a stranger will pick up. We drove in silence back to town. Only now the radio seemed to scrape at the edges of my hearing with static that sounded suspiciously like laughter. A week passed, and the incidents multiplied in the small ways that make you begin to understand the shape of a thing. Lights in the plant flickered without warning. The HVAC system that had been temperate my whole life screamed like a throat being cleared. People began to report minor things: a shadow at the edge of a yard, a stray dog that refused to cross near the bridge, a cold that lived behind your teeth. Marjorie told me a story one evening while we sat on her stoop drinking bad coffee. Decades ago, before the canal was diverted and the bridge was built, there had been an old stone crossing, and a family lost a child in the winter. They'd never found the boy. People had gone looking in the woods, but nothing returned. People forget, she said, until something remembers for them. She spoke carefully, like a woman who kept her words inside to avoid waking something. I started finding small offerings in my mailbox: a smooth pebble with a child's crayon circle on it, a scrap of ribbon the color of dried blood. Once, my kitchen light flickered, and when it steadied, there was a wet footprint on the floor, too small to be any adult's and not like any child's shoe I knew. Laura wanted to leave. She wanted to pack and go back to a city that believed in hospital doors and witnesses and security systems. But Livonia was in my blood in an easy way, sticky and stupid, and I could not imagine leaving it, while something that had traced my steps waited in the dark to come calling again. That night, the phone rang at 2:03 a.m. The number was a one-digit display of a blank. I picked it up. At first, there was only water, the sound of rain on metal and some deep, slow current, and then the voice hummed my name, not quite my own. It whispered a set of numbers: 10 to 12, 19. The date. The arc of it fit like a knotted rope around my throat. My hands went numb. Whoever called hung up before I could answer. Ethan didn't come over the next evening. He texted instead, "Can't do it, man. Something's off." His text stopped at midnight with a string of apologies and a final line I would later replay in my head, like a hymn. "If it wants you, don't go alone." But go I did, because there is a compulsion in fear I'd not known, to see the thing that watches you and find out whether it's only watching or whether it has plans. I drove to the bridge at night with only the headlights of my pickup and the flat blade of a flashlight. The wind had a voice that night, and the water looked like oil in a black pan. I left the truck idling and walked toward the railing and to the same spot where the plastic horse had been, where the cardboard still lay soggy and scrawled like a map to something you didn't want to find. The bridge was empty when I stepped onto it. But the air above the water moved like someone breathing, and the sound that rose up was not wind. It was the chorus of 1,000 small, wet mouths singing my name at different pitches. The faces beneath the surface pressed closer to the glass of the canal, eyes opening in a slow, apologetic way as if they had been waiting for my return. And then, clearer than any of it, a silhouette detached itself from the far bank and walked along the water's edge, the same figure I had seen the first night, hands on the railing like a man thinking. It smiled, and I understood with a clarity that felt like falling that the bridge had been waiting for me to notice it as more than a place to walk over water. It had been hunting for someone willing to answer a call. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but that's the lie fear tells itself when it wants to understand the shape of the thing that hunts you. In the morning after the bridge, the world behaved like a friend who didn't know you had been hurt. Coffee shops filled, mail carriers sang through their rounds, and the town council met about a pothole on Plymouth Road. I tried to be a man who could live inside ordinary things. I mowed my failing lawn. I told Ethan jokes that landed like stones. I repaired a flickering fixture at work and pretended the tremor in my hands was just a caffeine thing. But the bridge didn't stop at the canal. It threaded itself through my life like ivy, squeezing space and logic until both started to rot. Small things worsened. The laundromat's dryer would hum a lullaby in an unfamiliar key, and Laura stopped staying overnight because she said she could taste the river on her tongue when she woke up in my bed. She started leaving a candle burning in the kitchen, which did nothing for our luck, but made our apartment smell of tallow and regret. At work, Tom's grin narrowed in private moments, and he kept asking me whether I'd ever been to the old stone crossing outside town, the one people said had been replaced when the county rerouted the canal. You want a rumor in Livonia, you get a dozen. But the one that stuck came from a woman named Agnes Klein, who ran the Historical Society like a person cataloging ghosts for a living. Agnes had a voice that sounded like pages turning, And she believed in two things: records and the feeling that things from the past loved to be noticed. She brought me newspaper clippings folded into a neat stack: a boy gone missing in 1948, an obituary page with too many names, a letter to the editor that mentioned a coldness at the old crossing. Sometimes the living stand where the dead remember, she said, handing me an old photograph of children by the canal. Sometimes they ask for company. The photograph was a map of small faces, eyes shadowed by sun and smiles too bright for winter. In the far corner, a child perched on the rail of a wooden bridge, a taller boy reaching for his hand. The caption named them, little-known names that pressed like thorns through the town's surface. I traced the grain of the wooden bridge in the photograph until the timbers blurred beneath my fingertip. Agnes mentioned the family who had lost their boy, the Harrows. They'd been the kind of people who don't dry their grief in public. They carried it inside them until the town's memory smoothed its edges. But the river remembers differently. The water keeps what the town throws away. That knowledge did not help me sleep. One evening, Sheriff Reynolds stopped by my job, this time with a seriousness that felt like weather rolling in. He'd come because Ethan hadn't shown up for his shift and because Laura's cousin had seen a figure walking late along Farmington. He asked me to describe the eyes I'd seen, the sound, the paper on the door. He listened without the easy dismissiveness of the first time, and when he left, he did not say, "Don't worry." Instead, he handed me an old key with a number stamped into it and said, "Old storage, under the archives. The Harrows kept things down there. Maybe it's time someone opened what they kept." I used the key like a trespasser of my own life. In the municipal archives, under a concrete floor that smelled faintly of varnish and time, I found a trunk bound in rust. Inside were toys, drowned dolls with seaweed hair, a slate chalkboard with a child's scribble, a raincoat too small to have ever fit a full-grown adult. Tucked beneath them was a letter folded into a prayer. It was written by Miriam Harrow, dated November of 1948. She wrote of a child who walked into the water and smiled as if stepping into the arms of a familiar thing. "If the water remembers him," she wrote, "then perhaps it will leave a place for him to come home." The last line was the one that hit me in the chest. "Do not answer the calls, for the river will always be kinder than we are." If the river had kindness, it was a kindness that fed on answers. The next night, Ethan called. His voice trembled like an old wire. He'd been on his way to meet me at the plant, and the road had been slick with fog. He'd seen a figure on the shoulder and stopped. A child sat in the grass by the canal, shivering but smiling, and Ethan, kind as he was stupid, had gone to help. The child had looked up at him and said, "They said you'd come." Ethan laughed, the kind of laughter people use to pretend to be brave, and then the line went dead. The phone pinged twice and then filled with a text message that was only letters without vowels, a childish scrawl meant to be a joke. CNME. Come me. I drove like a man fleeing his own shadow. At the canal, a circle of people had gathered. Neighbors with flashlights, Marjorie with a thermos, Sheriff Reynolds with a flashlight, and a look that finally admitted he had reached the edge of his understanding. In the water, the light picked up shapes that were not quite faces, but were too many to be nothing. The river answered our lights by brightening its own dark like a stage being readied. We found Ethan at the far bank, hunched over and whispering to the water like a penitent. He'd not been dragged under. He'd gone involuntary, fingers tracing the current, smiling in a way that made my stomach drop. He told us he had seen something old and small and hungry, that it had asked his name and then his life by pretending to be lost. He wiped water from his mouth and said the word home, like a prayer. Ethan left that night to stay with his sister in Ann Arbor. He texted once, "It followed me home." That's the last time I heard from him in full sentences. The town split then into people who moved their couches away from windows and those who pretended light would be enough. Laura started keeping long knives in the kitchen drawer. Tom began bringing a petri dish of something foul to the office that he kept locked in his locker as if storing a confession. Marjorie sent me casseroles that tasted like patience. I returned to the bridge alone, as men do when they want to bargain with shame. The figure was there, more defined under the lamps of the municipal streetlight. Not a child exactly, and not entirely adult. It had the tilt of a listener, the posture of someone patient enough to wait years for company. When I stepped closer, it cocked its head, and the water responded like a chorus of tiny bells. "You came," it said, and the voice was both my own and not like memory speaking in the mirror. I thought I could bargain. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice the sort a man uses when he tries to negotiate with rain. "My name," it said. "We remember names. We like names." And then it spoke the name of the boy in the photograph on Agnes's table. The name that had never been spoken aloud in my presence. Thomas Harrow. The river was reciting family trees. The thing at the railing smiled with the slow, patient smile of someone who knows a secret. "Stay," it said. "Stay with us. We will make room." I felt the pull then. Not physical like a rope, but a sense of being needed so profoundly that resistance felt like cruelty. The water below gleamed with faces, each one pressing toward the light with a hunger that was not angry but entitled. I stepped backward because my feet remembered a life that involved daylight and grocery lists and the smell of Laura's hair in the morning. But when I looked back, the bridge had shifted, and in that impossible moment I realized the town and the canal had been rearranged without the consent of anyone alive. I ran. The bridge rang under my feet like a bell, each step a warning. Behind me, the voice called my name and some other names as if reciting invitations. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the summer lights faded and the town's small kindnesses began to fray, I did what you do when you're clumsy with courage. I asked for help. I went to Agnes with the trunk in my hands and the Harrow letter pressed like a confession against my palm. Sheriff Reynolds, who had the tired patience of a man who'd seen small towns swallow storms whole, agreed to stand with me. Marjorie baked a pie and brought it to the meeting like an offering, and Laura, stubborn and furious in the way love makes people brave, said she'd come, whether I wanted her to or not. We planned very little, which is to say we planned the only thing practical people can plan in the face of something that remembers, to be present and to speak. Agnes insisted on names, on reading aloud the record of the dead, so that the river would know they were not nameless things to be collected. Sheriff Reynolds marked a circle of police tape around the bridge. Tom, who'd been growing quieter at work, came with a flashlight that trembled in his hand like a man trying to make his bones hold. Ethan's absence sat between us like an accusation. We did not know whether to mourn him or to chase him. The night we made our stand, the sky had the low, bruised color of an illness. The canal looked black enough to swallow light and thin enough for sound to move across it like a voice. We positioned ourselves along the railing, and Agnes pulled from her satchel a list, brittle with age, of names she'd found in the archives. She read them slowly, each syllable a small bell. Thomas Harrow, Abigail Morse, Curtis Lane, names that the town had once whispered and then smoothed into silence. We spoke them so the water couldn't claim them as forgotten. At first, the water answered with nothing but the ordinary ripple of a current. Then a face rose, faint and smudged, beneath the surface, the suggestion of cheekbones, the blur of an old grin. The bridge thrummed underfoot like an animal waking. A voice tried to fold itself over Agnes's reading, a whisper that wanted us to trade names for company. It mimicked voices we loved. It offered us the warmth of being seen. I stepped forward and felt the pull. Not a physical drag so much as the tug of an expectation that I would move toward the emptiness the river offered. I could feel the thing behind it, patient as a thing that has waited decades. "Stay," the voice lilted. It held promises like presents wrapped in moss. "We remember," Agnes said, louder now, and she beat the cadence of her words like a metronome. "We remember your people. You are not an invitation." She read another name. The surface of the canal shuddered as if a large hand had passed beneath it. That was when Laura screamed. She had been standing a little away from the others, and some small, soft shape had emerged at her feet. A shoe with a drawing etched into its heel, the same childish marks we'd found before. The shoe tipped toward the water like a toy pushed by an unseen hand. Laura reached down, and the river's voice turned my name into a plea. For a breath, I thought she would step forward, so small and human was her intention to help. I grabbed her wrist. Her nails were the color of someone who'd been hanging on too long. Behind us, the town's lights dimmed as if the whole place had taken a deep-held breath. Something moved beneath the bridge in a syncopated ripple. Faces pressed to the glass of the canal, mouths opening and closing like dolls. Sheriff Reynolds took a step forward and shouted into the dark, "We know your names. You are remembered. Leave them be." The voice rose then, and it was not a single sound, but the gathering of all the nights I'd laid awake imagining what might come. It offered an image of warmth, a laughing child, clean and small, reaching for a hand. The temptation was surgical. It cut into whatever tenderness we still had and offered a balm that smelled like forgiveness. I thought of the Harrow's letter, of Miriam's line that said the water would be kinder than the living. The kindness on offer would be the theft of a life, a swapping of breath for memory. To yield would be to make the town keep its days, but trade them for people who could not come home. I took one step toward the railing and called back the name the river had given me. Not the name in the photograph, not the names on Agnes's list, but my own, the sound of my voice, a tether. "Daniel Porter," I said, and I said it with everything I had. The syllables made me feel naked and honest and very small. The voice in the water echoed it and then tried to fold it into something softer, something it could keep. "Don't answer." Agnes, she sounded like someone pointing a flashlight at snakes in the grass. "Remember them, but don't trade yourself." The river grasped for me like cold hands. I felt my knees buckle under the weight of the offering. For a second, I saw the whole town stepping across the railing into a gentle dark where nothing ever aged. And I could have closed my eyes and let it be over. But the people around me were not only names on paper. They were living throats and boxed-in laughter and stubborn, breathy curses. I thought of Laura's hands in my coat, of Marjorie's pie, of Ethan's laugh. I could not let the river have them because all horror is simple math. Give it one thing, and it will ask for another. So I did the only reckless human thing left. I laughed, a short, jagged sound. And then I stepped back from the railing. The motion was a refusal. Around me, the faces under the water rippled and then receded like fish startled by a net. The current sighed a long, disappointed sound, and the chorus of voices thinned into the sound of a small stream. We did not defeat it that night. You don't meet something that has waited decades and win a clean victory. But we learned that memory can be a weapon if used honestly. We read names until our throats tore and the town's lights came back like small, stubborn stars. Sheriff Reynolds led patrols along the canal for weeks, and Agnes organized a remembrance for the lost children where people left toys not as offerings to trade, but as markers, so the river would know someone still cared enough to call their names aloud. Ethan never returned. Tom took a job across the state and left a note on my workbench that said simply, "Keep the light on." Laura and I packed up our lives some months later and moved to a place where the water ran clear and the bridges did not sing. I tell you that because the story is meaner if it pretends otherwise. We left a town that we loved and a water that remembered, and the river kept its own counsel. Sometimes at night, in places with loud traffic and blinds pulled tight, I still hear a hint of it, the small, wet sound of a voice that wants to be counted. I find myself naming my friends aloud in the dim, a superstition I cannot explain besides the fact that naming is an action that demands acknowledgement. Agnes's box of clippings lives with me in a closet. I read them sometimes and lay them out in the light like photographs on a table. Laura lights a candle on cold nights. We do what we can, remember, not because remembrance frees us entirely, but because it offers a small defense. So if you ever walk by a canal or a bridge in a town that seems sleeping, and you hear a tiny, friendly voice calling a name you know or a name you don't, do this for me. Don't answer with a step forward. Sit down, speak the names of the living, or read aloud the newspaper, or sing a stupid song until even the water grows bored. Naming something keeps it honest. It refuses the bargain the dark will always offer. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Gavin Archer. I'm 32 years old, and the night that changed everything for me happened on October 13th, 2015. I say those words plain because the dates and names matter when you're trying to pin down what people call a truth, and because telling the truth out loud is the first thing I learned to do after that night, even when the truth tastes like metal. Livonia, Michigan looks unremarkable from a passing car window. tidy lawns, chain grocery stores, strip malls with fluorescent signs, and old maples that spill their leaves like confetti in the fall. But the particular stretch where I lived, a tight grid of streets near a drained swamp and an abandoned elementary school, carried a different kind of hush. You could stand at the corner of Maplecrest and Bramwell and feel like the town had stopped breathing for a moment. People who had lived there forever called that hush the way Livonia holds its secrets, and I used to laugh with them because it sounded poetic and not at all threatening. My story starts with the people around me. There was Mallory Price, my upstairs neighbor, who taught piano lessons and always left a tea kettle on the stove. Mallory's laugh was the sort that filled a room, and for months after the incident, I sought that sound like a lifeline. Trent Mason was my childhood friend who'd never figured out how to stay in one job more than a year. He'd take a job at a landscaping company, then quit to flip sneakers online, then start a handyman gig. Rosa Kim ran the corner deli and knew every recipe for comfort food. She kept a jar of peppermint candies on the counter and handed them to you when you looked tired. An old man named Bramwell, not related to the street name, though people joked he had more rights to it than the township, would sit on his porch and watch the world as if it were a television he couldn't change the channel on. And there was Officer Neil Whitman, the local patrol cop who knew everyone's dog and everyone's childhood secrets, and who later showed up at my door in the kind of uniform that made everything look official and terrible at once. I worked nights then, third shift at a printing plant on the east side. Night work teaches you small, lonely rituals. The way a city looks under sodium lights, the hush of streets when everyone else is asleep, the way distant freeway traffic sounds like someone breathing through a pillow. I liked the hours because I got my days back. Yard work, the gym, the grocery store at noon when it's quiet. I say liked because we tell ourselves stories to survive, and my story was that my life was ordinary and manageable. I had a cheap pickup truck with a dent in the passenger door from a shopping cart. My mother called every Sunday. Mallory and I shared casseroles and gossip. Trent and I drank bad beer and tried to act like adults. It was the kind of patchwork life that looks stable on a high-level scan and is all seems up close. Livonia had its local legends too, as every old place does. Folks told stories about the drained wetland, once called Hollow Fen, that used to be a haven for frogs and birds, until the county rerouted a creek and let it dry like a wound. Some said you could still smell damp earth there after a week of heavy rain. Others swore there were old foundations hidden in the reeds, evidence of cabins that were never mapped on any town plans. The abandoned elementary school at the end of Bramwell was a magnet for dares. Teenagers would paint graffiti on its cinder block walls, and every now and then someone would report flashlights in the windows. Kids, or raccoons, or something the darkness wanted you to believe was other people. When I first moved into the rental house, the owners mentioned a few items in the paperwork: low ceilings in the basement, a broken kitchen faucet they planned to fix sometime, and a clause about not tampering with the landscaping because the property had an old drainage pipe buried near the back lot line. It was boilerplate and boring. I kept a list on my phone of things to fix around the house: tighten the porch light, replace the smoke alarm battery, and ask Mallory to remind me to call the landlord about the faucet. That list mattered more after the fact because it was a ledger of things I had left undone. People around Livonia were generous in the way small towns are. They'd borrow a ladder or bring over a pan of lasagna if you had a bad week. But every community has edges, and Livonia's edge was the way folks turned away from certain conversations. If you asked about what used to be near the drained wetland, you might get a story about a family that moved away in the 70s and no one really spoke of it, or you might get silence and a quick change of subject. I used to think that kind of silence was a polite way to shrug off sadness. The night of October 13th would teach me that silence sometimes means something is waiting, patient and old, like a tide that knows eventually someone will step into it. Before the main thing I need to tell you about, the thing that makes strangers ask me years later if I still go back to that postal route, or if I ever sleep without looking at the windows, I want you to understand that Livonia's terror didn't arrive out of nowhere. It had an ancestry. The drained fen that no longer spoke, the school that had been abandoned like an afterthought, a rumor of a lost child from decades before that people mentioned only in whispers at barbecues. The setting was ordinary. The pieces were ordinary. The ordinary is what makes terror feel personal, because it means ordinary people can be upended by something that doesn't care about ordinariness. It was a Tuesday when it happened, a detail I can still taste, the way you can remember the exact day after something big breaks. I had just finished a 12-hour shift, the sky soft and dim with that early evening onion skin light. The truck's heater pushed warm air into my face. I was thinking about the grocery list. Eggs, coffee, a new set of light bulbs. Mallory's music was through the floorboards, a Debussy piece that usually calmed me down. Trent had texted me earlier, saying he might swing by to borrow my power drill. The mailbox creaked when I opened it, the small, mundane sounds that make up the spine of a neighborhood night. And then the main story started. A sound at the back of the lot, something like the dragging of boots through a field of dry reeds, but deeper, a presence that moved in rhythms like someone breathing through a long, cold night. The air changed. The streetlight at the end of the block guttered, and for a moment the world lost its edges. I went to the back door because that was the place you go when something isn't right. It felt foolish and necessary at once. What happened next I will tell plainly, because the truth is the only payment I can give for what I survived. The details are sharp. They have been polished by memory and insomnia. They are also heavy, so if you need to put this page down and come back later, do so. But if you are still here with me, then keep your hands warm and listen. The night did not forgive, and Livonia's hush cracked like ice. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I opened the back door and the air hit me, like someone had turned a faucet on inside the night. Cold, thin, and smelling faintly of wet earth, though there hadn't been rain in days. The backyard was a dark rectangle, framed by the houses that pressed close together on Bramwell Street. Beyond the chain link at the rear, the ground sloped toward where the drained fen used to be. Moonlight made a pale wash across the lawn, and there, halfway between my sagging garden shed and the fence, something caught and reflected that light, a small, dull shape half buried in the mulch. I walked out barefoot because my brain does that strange, brave thing where it ignores common sense. The thing in the mulch was a shoe, a child's sneaker, gray with faded blue stripes, the kind you buy at the drugstore. It was small enough that my first thought was that someone had left it there during a game. My second thought came like a hand on my shoulder. There weren't kids playing in our yards at midnight on a Tuesday. The sneaker was wet on the inside as if it had been dipped, and tucked into the toe was a scrap of paper. I crouched, and my hands trembled when I unfolded it. On the paper was a child's drawing, messy lines that could have been a house and stick figures and a sun that had teeth. In the corner, written in block letters with a blue crayon, was a name, Tommy. I recognized the name because I had heard it once, years earlier, in a hushed tone at Rosa Kim's deli. Someone had mentioned a boy who had disappeared from the edge of town in the 70s or 80s, the kind of rumor that clings to oak trunks and never goes away. I told myself then that I couldn't be sentimental about rumors. Now, crouching on my lawn at midnight with a child's sneaker in my hands, rumor and reality braided together into something I could not easily unsee. I called Neil Whitman before I called anyone else. A part of me wanted to be the calm homeowner who found a lost toy and did the reasonable thing. Another part wanted help, because human beings are not supposed to unearth small severed pieces of other people's lives in their backyard and remain calm. Whitman arrived with his flashlight and that particular look of a man who'd seen too many small tragedies to be surprised, but still bothered to care. He took the sneaker in gloved hands, called for a patrol car over his radio, and asked me the standard questions. When I had last been outside, if anyone else had been in the yard, whether I'd noticed strangers around. I answered. My answers sounded thin. The patrol car lights made the house next door look like a stage set. Sirens weren't necessary. This was a Livonia night, not the interstate. Whitman bagged the sneaker and the drawing as evidence and told me to wait on the porch while they checked the area for anything else. Bramwell shuffled onto his porch in his robe, peered at the lights, and said, Lordy, the way an old man says a prayer under his breath. Mallory stuck her head out of her kitchen window, pale and worried, and handed me a blanket without a word. They found footprints at the back fence, 2 sets, one small and neat, barefoot, and one larger, booted. The smaller prints headed toward the drainage ditch, then stopped at the edge where the reed growth began. The larger prints circled the yard once and then headed off toward Hollow Fen. A neighbor's security camera, the cheap kind you buy online and mount by the gutter, had a shadow crossing its field of view at 11:43 p.m., too quick to identify, too clear to ignore. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Lila Grant, who had the efficient, patient manner of someone who balanced compassion with paperwork. She asked about my life, my job, my friends, where I was on the night of the 13th. When I told her I worked nights, she wrote something down and nodded. When I told her about the rumor of the lost boy, she folded her hands and said nothing for a long moment. Names get reused, she told me finally, her voice even. We will check missing persons files from the county. That phrase, check the files, made the room cold. Files felt like old secrets to be unzipped, and I had just handed the zipper a handle. The next morning, the town hummed with an undercurrent, like a single bass note that vibrated through the bones of Livonia. People walked differently. They kept their heads turned. Rosa Kim quietly closed her deli an hour early. Trent showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee, and the sort of bravado I knew was a fragility pretending to be courage. He wanted to talk about the sneaker like it was an oddity, something to be solved like a crossword. I wanted to believe him. Instead, we both stood on the porch and watched the plain wooden gate and felt the silence press. Over the following week, things accumulated like snowfall, small, quiet, hard to reverse. The county patrol dug in the mud by the fen and found a piece of a child's plastic toy and an old, rusted belt buckle with initials barely legible. RM. The records Lila Grant pulled up weren't neat. 2 names matched the letters on the buckle. Richard Miles, reported missing in 1979, age 9, and Raymond Moore, reported missing in 1981, age 8. Neither case had ever been closed. The files were thin, filled with typed reports and the kind of amateurish hand-drawn maps that make you imagine people running in shoes that slip on wet leaves. Sleep stopped being an ally. I lay awake thinking about small prints vanishing into reeds, about the way old things never go quietly. Mallory started sleeping at her sister's house after 3 nights of hearing what she described as someone talking in a voice that isn't a voice beneath the floorboards. Bramwell swore he'd seen a light down by the fen that moved without a person holding it. Neil Whitman came by with a thermos sometimes, and what looked like a consoling apology for the town's failure to keep its past from turning into other people's present. As the police dug and the neighbors whispered, Livonia's hush grew more complicated. Some folks wanted answers. Others wanted to close their curtains and pretend the shoe had been the result of a prank. A couple of teenagers posted grainy videos online, feeding the rumor mill with speculation about cults and old drainage pipes and even something supernatural. The videos did what videos do. They distorted, simplified, and made monsters out of shadows. I tried to be reasonable in the face of all this. I tried to be the kind of man who believed in cause and effect. But there are moments that do not bow to explanation. One night, walking home from a late shift, I found Mallory standing at the corner of Maplecrest and Bramwell, barefoot and shaking, holding a rusted key with a tag that had the same initials as the buckle, RM. She'd found it under her piano bench, as if the house itself had coughed it up. I didn't touch the basement, she kept saying. I swear I didn't. But something else had touched the house. The key looked ordinary and important the way old things do, small objects that carry the weight of years and forgetfulness. We decided to go to the fen together, because people make choices like that in the dark. They gather courage in numbers and walk toward whatever is rusting the edges of their lives. We walked with flashlights and a stubborn kind of hope. The reeds bowed to us but did not tell us their stories. At the water's edge, Thomas, a boy from down the street who had been part of every dare ever undertaken in Livonia, pointed to a cluster of stones half sunken in muck. There, dragged as if by a slow animal, was the outline of something large and old, a concrete slab that looked as though it had been moved in pieces. On top of the slab, someone had painted a child's sun with black paint. The sun's smile had long teeth. We left the fen that night with more questions and less sleep. The town's past was no longer a rumor. It had become physical, present enough to be scraped by a boot. People started locking their doors in a way that suggested not fear of strangers, but fear of whatever memory that town owed and had stopped paying. I began to understand that some nights do not want to be explained. They want witnesses. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The days after the fen search felt like living inside a clock that had lost its hands. Time passed, but you couldn't tell how fast. People moved through the town with small, careful gestures. A milk carton slid silently across a counter, a porch light left on until dawn. Detective Lila Grant worked the case like a surgeon, peeling at layers of municipal paperwork and faded newspaper clippings. She found a brittle article from 1980 about an ill-fated drainage project and a contractor who'd vanished from public favor after cost overruns and whispered complaints. The name on the invoices matched the initials we'd seen. R. McAllister, a man who'd overseen a rerouting of the creek that fed Hollow Fen. No one in the article was accused of violence. The town had argued about money, and the money had gone somewhere quiet. When Lila traced the contractor's records to a P.O. box and a corporate filing, the mailbox turned up empty and the filings soaked with red tape. It was the kind of bureaucratic dead end that smells like an answer and tastes like a lie. She kept at it. Neil Whitman kept bringing coffee. Bramwell kept saying things under his breath about old debts. Mallory kept lights on in the piano studio, even though the keys felt like they might snap if she touched them. Then things stopped being just about evidence and started being about the house. Objects found with no explanation turned up in places they'd never been. A child's marbles in the kitchen sink, a scrap of a faded blue shirt draped over the back of my truck, a small handprint in condensation on my basement window that was there one morning and gone the next. Each time we found something, Livonia contracted and held its breath as if inhaling might pull whatever had been sleeping into awakeness. One late afternoon, Lila called me with a new lead. She'd been at the county archive, sifting microfiche and rot-stained ledgers, when she found a police blotter note from 1979 that had been missed. The unidentified boy found near drainage work. Property owner denies knowledge. Case referred to juvenile services. There was no follow-up in the county file, nothing that tied a name to the boy. But someone had written in the margin years later a single line in an officious hand, "Case closed. No evidence." That line had a different pen, a different era, and the kind of finality that feels like someone slamming a lid on a coffin. Why would they write "no evidence" when someone found a boy? I asked Lila over the phone. Her response was a pause that took up the line. "Paperwork gets messy, Gavin. People assume other people take care of things. We'll keep looking." We did keep looking. We searched the old contractor's storage locker, the one that had been auctioned off after the company dissolved, and found under a layer of rusted nails and a tuft of old insulation a child's belt buckle with RM scratched into the leather. It was the same buckle. Lila ran a forensics check and came back with a quiet kind of answer. The metal had been handled much more than you would expect and had an old dried residue that matched nothing in their databases. She looked at me then and said, "This town has been burying things that want not to be buried." That night, I had my first real confrontation with whatever had been circling the margins of my life. I was stirring cold coffee at 3 a.m, the house buzzing with the small electric noises of appliances and distant traffic, when the phone rang. No name on the screen. I answered with the automatic politeness of someone who does night shifts. Someone breathed on the other end, a child's inhale, quick and uneven, and then a whisper, "Find the sun." The line clicked dead. I told myself it was a prank. I told myself my neighbor's kids were messing around. But Mallory had heard something too. She called me from her sister's with her voice thin and urgent. "Gavin, I thought I heard a music box. It sounded like school bells underwater." She had found a scrap of paper under her pillow with a sun drawn on it, the same crooked-toothed grin we'd seen painted on the slab at the fen. We began to realize that what had been scattered across town wasn't random. Items clustered around certain names, certain properties, the drained lot near the McAllister pipe, the basement of the old elementary school, the back garden of the house next to mine where a family had once lost a little boy. Patterns are comfortingly human. They let you imagine a cause. But these patterns had a geometry that felt older and more patient than anything human. Then the dreams started. I don't like to speak of them much because they're private in the way nightmares are, the kind of intimacy that leaves you raw. In the dreams, I was a child again, splashed with mud, running through reeds taller than my head. There was always a sun in the sky that grinned with black paint. Sometimes the sun whispered a name. Sometimes it sang. Sometimes it asked me to remember the way a wound remembers the edge of a blade. The dreams bled into the days. I would wake with the taste of iron and the feeling that something had brushed my shoulder as I slept. I began finding scratches on my arms in the morning, thin, pale, as if fingernails had traced letters I couldn't read. Mallory woke with the smell of smoke, even when the house was cold. Neil Whitman started patrolling later than usual, driving slow-mo circles past my house, his headlights cutting a lazy path through the dark. 1 week after the sneaker, a child from the neighborhood, Tommy Reyes, 13, who'd been friends with Trent since middle school, vanished after dark. He'd been at a study group, said he was heading home, and never arrived. His bicycle was found by the chain link at the fen with the seat bent, and a single marble lay on the saddle like an offering. The town's undercurrent became a roar. Parents huddled like frightened birds. Neil called it a disappearance, but everyone who'd been awake that night said it with a different voice, a frightened certainty that the past and the present had met and exchanged something. That night, after Tommy disappeared, a heat lightning storm rolled over Livonia, a quick, crackling sky that made the autumn smell of crushed leaves and ozone. I tried to sleep and couldn't. At 2:17 a.m., a pounding shook my front door. I threw it open and Neil stood there with rain on his uniform and desperation in his eyes. "Heard something," he said. "Thought it might be you." We went out into the rain together. The fen reflected the flashes like a second sky. Near the chain link, something moved, a blur of small feet and a burst of noise that made the hair on my arms stand like bristles. Neil's flashlight found a small figure crouched under the lip of the drainage culvert. We called out. It didn't answer like a child. It answered with a paper's whisper and a sun that seemed to be smiling just beyond the beam. I reached down and felt colden soil and something softer. Another sneaker, a matching one, but empty. The feeling that rose in me then was not fear so much as an understanding that whatever had been sleeping in Livonia's underside was waking with appetite. The town had paid attention to the wrong things for too long, and now the ledger was due. I promised myself then, with a hard vow that thinned my voice, that we would find Tommy Reyes, not just because the law demanded it, because the town's hush had become a wound that would not heal until someone named it aloud. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The rain had washed the town clean of its small talk pretenses, but it hadn't washed anything else away. The morning after Neil found the empty sneaker by the culvert, Lila called an emergency meeting at the precinct. She had enough fragments of paperwork and the county's dusty ledger entries to push the case from rumor into motion. Not everyone's gone yet, she told us, meaning the evidence and the people who had hidden it. Her voice carried the kind of resolve that makes others stop pretending everything will stay the same. We converged on the one place that kept coming up in the old maps and the new scars on the land, the crumbling office where R. McAllister's company once ran its machinery. The building sagged like an old man in a chair, its sign long gone, its paperwork scattered and sodden in a basement that smelled like mildew and oil. Bramwell came with us. I'd never seen him move so quickly. He kept his hands buried in his coat as if trying to hide the shaking. Lila had a search warrant. Men with shovels and heavy gloves lined up behind her. We cut power, unbolted rusted doors, and pushed inside. The place was an archaeological site of bad intentions. Old invoices with names scratched out, a ledger with dates that matched missing children reports, boxes stamped with municipal seals, and a heater that hummed like a thing that keeps secrets warm. In a locked corner under a tarp and a stack of weathered plywood, someone had hidden a trapdoor. When we opened it, a hole of stale air breathed up and hit our faces. Inside, narrow steps led down into a concrete room that had once been a maintenance access to the rerouted culvert system. It smelled like earth and old cloth and the kind of neglect that ghosts prefer. On the floor were toys, marbles, a dented tin soldier, a little rubber frog whose paint was rubbed thin, arranged around a small painted sun on the concrete. The sun's grin was the same crooked-toothed smile we'd seen in the fen and on the slab. We called for more lights and wrapped the room in official procedures. There were small beds, not proper ones, more like platforms, and chalk marks on the wall that looked like dates written by small hands. They were not all the dates of disappearance. Some were birthdays, some were names. We began to understand that this was a place where someone had tried, in the strange arithmetic of fear and hope, to keep children close and hidden. We also found evidence of interfering hands, photographs of the project sites, notes about payments, names circled and crossed. Hidden inside a waterproof tube was an envelope with a list of initials and dates, and scrawled in a different hand beneath them. I didn't know what to do. Bramwell's face turned the color of old paper. He sat down on a crate and, for the first time in years, said the words that had been eating at him in the dark. He told us, in halting sentences, what he remembered. As a young foreman, he had been on site during the rerouting, a night when equipment failed and a pipe collapse had trapped a group of kids who'd been playing near the drainage. Panic and confusion had spiraled into a shameful choice. Men who were afraid of losing their contracts and being ruined made a decision to bury an accident instead of report it. Bramwell claimed he had not killed any child with malice, that it had been a moment of cowardice that grew into many moments of covering up. His voice broke when he said the name Richard Miles. He named others. He confessed to moving things and sealing openings and signing reports that fed into a ledger of denial. The admissions did not undo what had been done. They only let us start naming the dead. We called in a forensic unit. They worked slowly and gently because bones keep stories and must be handled with respect. Outside, the town gathered like a weathered audience. Rosa set up coffee and sandwiches. Trent drifted between people, hands clenched. Mallory sat on my porch and played Debussy softly, the music like a bandage on a bruise. Then, the miracle and the cruelty of the same morning. Down in the culvert system, connected as it turned out through a maintenance access that had been bricked over and forgotten, they found Tommy Rise. He was alive, curled in a narrow pocket of earth and concrete, dizzy and thin but alive. How he came to be there was a tangle of terror and bravado, a dare gone wrong, a chase into a maintenance passage, a misstep into a cavity that closed in a way the men of McAllister had known and hidden. Tommy had survived by a stubborn, childish will and by a small air shaft that kept him breathing. He could not explain the painted sun or the nights that had whispered to him, but he could say he'd heard voices and seen shadows that weren't quite shadows. Paramedics took Tommy, and for a long time that day, the town held its breath and then let it out in a sound that was equal parts sob and prayer. The missing names from the ledger were matched to cold cases. Some of those matches confirmed the worst. The forensics turned up human remains in shallow graves near the fen and in a collapsed service trench, and each discovery was announced with a terrible kindness that ensured dignity in death, even when dignity had been denied in life. Bramwell and a few others were arrested for obstruction and for their roles in the cover-ups. No court could bring back what was lost, but the legal machinery moved like a slow, practical prayer. People asked me afterward how it felt to watch the town unspool its secrets. I told them that grief and relief can sit in the same room. They live across from one another like old neighbors who no longer speak but cannot move away. For weeks, Livonia held vigils. Lila worked afternoons and nights, hunched over files and evidence like someone trying to stitch a map back together. Neil took on a quieter watch than before, the heavy, protective kind that comes from having seen the lining of a town's bones. In the end, what changed was not the trauma. Trauma is a weight that reshapes you, but the way we lived with it. People who had turned away learned, finally, to name what had been lost. The drained fen was fenced and dedicated as a memorial. We planted sunflowers there, ridiculous and stubborn, their faces tracking the sun in a way that felt like defiance and tenderness. Tommy, small and brave, recovered under the slow mercy of good food and a mother's iron will. Bramwell slept in a cell and wept sometimes. Sometimes Mallory would stop by with a plate and tell the story of a Debussy piece whose melody never quite ended. As for me, I kept my night shifts for a while because some rituals are harder to break. I learned to sleep with the curtains open and to hear our town differently. The dishwasher's clatter was no longer just a domestic noise. It was a sound that meant someone had come back from work and would eat tonight. I told the story to anyone who would listen because the telling felt like payment, an admission that we had not been pure, and a vow that we would do better. Years later, people still whisper about Livonia, but the whispers carry different weight. They speak of a town that found its courage late and paid for it with sleeplessness and truth. They speak of a painted sun that began as a child's crude mark and became, for the living, a promise to look after one another. Maybe that promise is small. Maybe it's the only kind that really matters. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Driscoll. I was 34 years old on October 13th, 2018, a night I still hear when the wind shifts through the maples by my old house in Livonia, Michigan. People who know me would call me steady. I ran the facilities team at a small medical office on 7 Mile Road, kept to a schedule, drank too much coffee, and loved old vinyl records more than any rational person should. My apartment, a narrow 2-story duplex on the west side of Livonia, had creaky floors that announced visitors like church bells in a basement that smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. I liked the place because it felt honest. There's a different kind of peace in a house that tells you its history through squeaks and stains. Before the October night, my life had an ordinary, reliable rhythm. I had a long-term girlfriend named Marissa Lane, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that shook her whole person, and a way of calling me E when I got too serious. We'd been together 3 years, and though we argued about paint colors and whether to get a dog, we both liked the same lazy Sunday rituals: coffee, crossword, Ray Sremmerd on low, and the sun pooling on the porch steps. My closest friend was Lucas Gray, a mechanic who ran a small shop off Inkster Road. Lucas could fix anything with an engine, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of local ghost stories, the kind he told at 2 a.m. over beers to make you keep the porch light on. He was the sort of friend who would show up with a spare key when you forgot yours, or a tow when your car decided it didn't want to cooperate, which was often. Lucas and I had grown up across town from each other. Our fathers worked different shifts at the same factory once, and we both learned the unspoken rule of looking out for the other. Across the street lived Janet McCall, a retired school bus driver who baked bread that made the entire block fragrant for hours. Janet knew everyone's business and had a soft spot for stray cats. Behind her house, on a lot that had been empty for decades, sat a small, squat building that once housed a neighborhood store. A relic with boarded windows and a crooked sign that read Livonia Market in peeling letters. Kids used to dare each other to peek in the dark windows when we were teenagers. The market was the kind of place that held stories in its walls. In small towns and suburbs like ours, old buildings hoard rumors like a hoarder hoards utensils. I wasn't a superstitious man. I believed in locks, in logical explanations, in police reports. Yet the neighborhood pulse had a softness to it. People waved, the high school stadium lights blinked a melancholy blue on Friday nights, and every autumn the maples painted everything orange. It felt safe, and that made the night in October feel, in retrospect, like a betrayal. Before the incident, there were small oddities I filed away like receipts. A porch light left on in the next duplex for 3 nights straight. The year was struck. A single footprint in the damp dirt by the back fence that didn't match any of our shoes. A shadow that lingered near the boarded market as if studying the glass. I mentioned these things to Marissa, and she shrugged, told me the city had drunks and late-night kids. "It's Livonia, not Salem," she joked. Lucas, on one of his late-night visits, laughed like he didn't want to be the one to say it aloud. "Older buildings breathe, man. Sometimes you catch a draft." Character sketches aside, I need you to know the cadence of that life, because horror, When it arrives, always breaks rhythm. There's the before, mundane, warm, predictable, and then there's the moment the song scratches and you realize you'd been humming along to the wrong tune. I'd like to tell you about the night in a way that paints the small details first. The smell of oil and fried onions from Janet's kitchen through the thin wall, the orange glow from a lone streetlight that turned the rain into stage lights, the way Marissa folded her hands when she read late-night lesson plans, all the ordinary things that make a place belong to you. I'll introduce the people who mattered because their reactions later will mean everything. Lucas with his grease-stained jacket and half-smile, Jan with her bread and bus stories, Marissa with her patience and stubbornness. Even the Livonia market will matter. A hollowed-out skeleton of a place that, until that night, was simply a piece of scenery. You should also understand the small civic personality of Livonia itself. Neat lawns, split-level homes, the supermarket that's always busy on Saturdays, the chain restaurants that have the same booths week to week. It's a place where news moves slowly and people still borrow sugar from one another. The most terrifying things in a place like that are usually traffic or a sudden hospital visit. That's why what happened felt so out of place, like a discordant note in a lullaby. People told me later that October was colder than usual that year. They remember the way the moon hung thin and the wind had a wet edge. What I remember is Jan's porch light on and the way the house settled around midnight, as if the city itself were taking a breath. I remember Lucas calling earlier that evening about a problem with a rebuilt carburetor and Marissa asking me to bring bread on my way home. I remember folding the laundry and putting a record on, Frank Sinatra, because it fit the dusk mood, and the house being very, very ordinary. I didn't get to the central part of the story for a long time because it's important that you know who I was, who loved me, and what I was protecting before the world tilted. So let me stop with the introductions for a second and give you the moment that changed everything. The small sound in the basement that I told myself was the furnace. At around midnight, when the record had finished its last croon and the house had settled into a rhythm of its own, the sound came again. It was a faint scraping, like a finger dragging across plywood from below. I told myself it was the old pipes. I told myself a lot of things that night, and then something moved where the floorboards met the cold, open seam beneath the stairs. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The scraping under the stairs was the kind of small sound that argues it's nothing. It doesn't demand immediate attention. It simply insists. I told myself one more time that it was the old house settling, the furnace, a raccoon with bad timing. But the second time it came, closer and sharper, I stopped folding the shirt and listened the way you listen for an ambulance that never comes. I took the steps down 2 at a time, my socked feet whispering against the wood. The basement light was a bare bulb that hung on a chain and threw everything into honest, hard relief. Boxes, a sagging washer, the old water heater that rumbled like some tired beast. At first, there was nothing out of place but for a thin smear of dust along the floor where someone, or something, had dragged itself. The smear led from the base of the steps to the old workshop bench and then stopped, as if whatever had left it decided to vanish into the concrete. I knelt to look closer. The dust had been disturbed by a pattern, small looped scratches like a child's doodle turned ugly. They cut into the dust and nosed toward the old coal chute, a tiny door half hidden under the stairs. That door had been shut and stubborn for as long as I'd lived there. I'd always joked it was a portal to tiny worlds. Tonight, the metal latch was open. You should know that my default is practicality. My mind reached for flashlights and logic. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the workbench and, like a man in an old movie, pushed the door open. The chute breathed out a cold that smelled faintly of iron and cedar. At the bottom, there was a shallow hollow in the dirt, something laid there like it had been set down in a hurry. A single man's shoe, damp and slightly smaller than mine, and beside it, a scrap of paper. The paper was folded tight. I hesitated because men hesitate before dropping the curtain, and because hesitation feels like the last good decision you make sometimes. I unfolded the paper. It wasn't a note in the way you expect a note to be. It was a child's page torn from a school book, the kind Marissa would recognize, multiplication tables printed in a plain font. but someone had scrawled over the margins in ink that looked like it had bled through from the other side. The writing was a looping, hurried script. "Get out." Then, beneath it, smaller and almost polite, "The market remembers." I put the shoe in the paper back and closed the chute. For a moment, I stood with my hand on the rusted latch, feeling ridiculous. Get out? The market remembers? It read like two separate minds arguing in a single sentence. A warning and a claim. I decided, sensibly, to call Lucas. Lucas showed up 10 minutes later with his usual half grin and the kind of flashlight that would embarrass the sun. He smelled of motor oil and cheap cologne and looked at the shoe like it was a particularly confusing carburetor part. "Someone's playing games," he said. He used the word games like he used it when a patient presented a mystery to him, with a surgeon's impatience and a mechanic's curiosity. We moved through the rest of the night in the way people do when they want to delay a conversation they can't avoid. We talked about everything else. Lucas told a story about a truck he'd fixed that came alive at highway speed. I told him about a boss who insisted on color-coded files. Outside, the street was a black ribbon with a single passing car like a moving star. Inside, the house felt like a held breath. In the morning, the neighborhood oriented itself around coffee and small rituals. I told Marissa about the shoe and the paper over an undercooked egg and a bagel. She listened with a teacher's patience. She wanted to sort the facts, to make an alphabet out of the noise. "We'll call the police," she said. "We'll tell them about the scrap and the shoot." There are few things less reassuring than the phrase, "We'll call the police when you're looking for comfort." We did. Officer Hernandez arrived with a quiet efficiency and the type of professionalism that makes you both grateful and a little ashamed. He walked the basement with his lanky stride and took pictures, his breath fogging in the cool air from his jacket. He nodded at the shoe as if shoes had legal precedent. He asked the standard questions, neighbors, enemies, recent visitors, and wrote them down in an old-fashioned notebook that had seen more than one winter. He promised to check the property report and to drive by the Livonia market, which he mentioned almost casually, as if the market were an old neighbor rather than an abandoned building. There's a human thing about paperwork that tries to contain the slippery. The officer's notes made the night feel less like an impossibility and more like a problem. It's astonishing what a man will cling to, the authoritative scratch of a pen as a barrier against panic. That afternoon, I walked over to Janet's house, because of course I did. Jan had lived in Livonia forever and knew the town's history the way some people know their family tree. She stood at her kitchen window, flower on her cheek, and said the market had been boarded up since the 70s. "Closed down after that Hoffman boy disappeared," she said, and her voice folded like bread. "No one came back for that place, not the same." "Hoffman?" I asked, and the room went still as she told me a watered-down version of an old story. A young man gone missing in the late 70s, whispers that he'd been a loner, that the market's owner had a bad temper, and a cellar full of secrets. It was the kind of rumor that came with a small smile and a larger pause. People shared it like a ghost story with tea. The details were hazy, but the outline fit the way neighborhoods remember: a name, a place, a shuttered building. I went to the boarded market that evening. The sun was falling hard, making the metal boards glow like gills. The sign, Livonia Market, hung crooked and mottled. There were stamps of old flyers and a child's scribble, "For sale," but the nails were rusted shut, and the place had the look of a mouth that had shut too long and forgot how to speak. I walked the perimeter and found fresh footprints in the soft mud near the back alley. They were too small to be mine, and they didn't match Lucas's broad-soled boots. They led to the alley that threaded behind the market and disappeared into the thickness of an overgrown lot between the store and the next house. In the corner of that lot, half sunk under vines, was a smashed wooden crate. Something dark and round lay inside it, like a stone or a worn doll's head. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I took a photograph with my phone and felt the absurd safety of lighted screens. That night, after we'd all tried to normalize the day into jokes and laundry and argued about whether to warn the landlord, the house tasted like tomorrow. I slept poorly. I dreamt of small hands digging in the dark, tracing the same looping script on the margins of my life. The market remembers. The main thing that changed, the thing that cut the rhythm into jagged pieces, came as a sound at 3 in the morning. It wasn't under the stairs this time. It was outside, delicate as a page turning. I lay in bed and listened to the house like a patient listens to their heartbeat. Then, soft as breath, there was a voice. Not a voice that spoke words, but a whisper that scraped against the siding. It said my name. I sat up as if pulled by a cord and heard it again, closer. Ethan. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The whisper that said my name at 3 in the morning had the patience of an old thing. It didn't rush me. It didn't demand. It coaxed. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, the sheets sticking to my calf, and thinking of all the quiet ways people call for help. A cough, a knocked pot, a hand at the window. This was none of those. This was a thing that had folded my name into the sound of the house so that when it said Ethan, it felt like it was calling me home and out at once. I put on pants and a jacket and went downstairs without waking Marissa. The porch was wet, and the street was a black ribbon with headlights like distant comets. I moved toward the back of the house as if being tugged on an invisible rope. The sound didn't come from the chute this time. It came from across the street, like someone clearing a throat inside a closed mouth. The Livonia market sat there under the moon, its boarded windows like slumbering eyes. As I reached the back alley, the air seemed to change. Not colder exactly, but thicker, like a room that has been inhaling the same scent for decades. The footprints I'd photographed the week before led straight to the market's rusted side door. A padlock hung half broken, and there were fresh scrapes where someone had tested it and not quite managed. I remember thinking, you are not a hero. You are a man in your 30s with a flashlight and a coffee habit, and the sensible thing is to call someone and wait. But I had already been divided in two. The part of me that wanted to be safe, and the other part that had heard a voice in my house call me by name and knew, absurdly, that if I didn't look, no one else would ever see what needed seeing. I slipped my phone into my pocket, found a pry bar under my jacket, Lucas's habit, leaving tools where they might be needed, and worked the lock. The metal screamed a small, private scream, and I pushed the door open. Inside the market was the smell of time. Dust lay in thick layers on counters, on old candy jars, on a ledger that had been closed and left like a heart that had stopped. The beam from my flashlight cut a narrow corridor of light. As I moved through, I heard it again. Not a whisper now, but the sound of chairs scraping, a boy laughing just over the horizon, a radio looping a jingle in a language my waking mind couldn't hold. The market felt like a paused life. Toward the back, behind the registers and a stack of yellowing newspapers, I found a trapdoor, its paint flaked and its hinge rusted, but recent marks surrounding it where someone had tested it with their palm. The air that came up when I lifted it carried a colder note and the scent of old wood. A stairwell led down into absolute dark. For a moment, I thought of abandoning the thing and calling the police. Then the name, Ethan, vibrated inside my skull again, softer this time, like thanks. Down there, the world did not pretend. The cellar was low and narrow, full of boxes and an old freezer that had long since surrendered. On a wall, someone had chalked a name, this time so faint I almost missed it. Thomas Hoffman. Below the name was a child's drawing. A sun with crooked rays and a small stick figure smiling. I remember how my breath left me, not from fear but from a strange, hollow recognition. The shoe from my basement was the twin to one that lay half buried under a layer of dust in the corner, a small, scuffed boy's sneaker with a lacing that had been tied in a hurry. I didn't look for blood or gore. There was none to see in the way horror movies show it, only the absolute, quiet fact of a life that had been stopped and hidden. There was a box of school books tied with twine, a lady's scarf folded neatly on top. Someone had tried to keep a human life tidy after stealing it. The market remembered more carefully than people did. It kept the details the neighbors had forgotten. I called the police with a voice as steady as I could make it. Officer Hernandez arrived and kept his professional face, but I saw something in his jaw tighten the way it does when a man has been asked to open a wound his hands can't stitch. They cordoned off the lot. Detectives came with their flashlights and notebooks, and for the first time, the instruments of order moved through the market like sunlight through dust. They found bones in a sealed crate beneath the rafters, and the investigators called in professionals to take samples. They dug carefully. They found more, items that matched what Janet had told me, small tokens no one else had thought to look for. A faded high school ring, a photograph curled in the corner. For the first night in nearly 50 years, Thomas Hoffman had a ledger entry in a police book. The arrest that followed was not cinematic. It was a slow, bureaucratic unspooling of an old man's pride and deceit. The owner of the market, an elderly man no one had thought much about in decades, had moved away and died years before. His son, who had been given the shop and had kept it boarded out of shame and greed, was found living in a suburb 2 counties over. He denied everything until evidence stacked like the receipts on his counters. The community learned that shame can be a kind of ownership, a way to keep a secret warm. When they exhumed the remains and matched dental records, when the coroner spoke softly to Marissa and me in a room that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, the town of Livonia exhaled. There were memorials, there were statements in the paper, and there was a small, guarded sense that the market's memory had been translated into a language our institutions could handle. But memory doesn't always give up neat endings. In the weeks after, I would still catch myself listening for footfalls under the stairs. Sometimes, late at night when the house settled, I would hear a whisper that sounded like a child counting, 1, 2, 3, and then my own name like someone checking a list. I think that's the truest thing. Discovering a hidden life doesn't always tidy your own. It rearranges you. I started bringing Marissa a small bouquet of flowers on Sundays because some habits stitch us in place. Lucas came by with a new set of sockets and an offer to build a shelf in the basement. People asked if I slept better. The truth was complicated. I slept more in the sense that my body returned to its allotted hours, but in the sense that matters, the deeper ease of being in the world, I was altered. I could no longer assume that a scrape in the dust was nothing. The maples outside my window seemed to whisper in a language I could almost understand. Sometimes I would walk past the boarded market site and lay my palm on the splintered wood as if to say thank you. Once, a child from down the block asked me why I always stopped there. I told him the truth in a voice that sounded like a different man. Because places remember, and sometimes they ask you to remember back. Eventually, the market was cleared and the lot fenced. The town put up a small plaque with Thomas Hoffman's name and his date. People put flowers there. At the funeral, the pastor spoke of being seen and of the obligation of memory. There were apologies that felt like loose coins thrown into a well. There was closure, which is an odd commodity, both valued and never quite complete. I often think about what the market wanted. Was it vengeance? A want for confession? Maybe it simply wanted acknowledgement, the way a diary wants a reader. In the end, I think what it wanted most was to be known. In a place like Livonia, where pages get filed and years slip fast, the market's memory kept the name Thomas Hoffman alive in its shelves and boxes until someone with ears came to listen. Now, when the wind comes off the alley in a certain way and the house groans against the weather, I hear the little things. The shuffle of a sneaker on concrete, the rustle of paper, a soft voice that runs like a pulse through the fence. I do not pretend to be brave. I am simply the man who heard a whisper and chose to answer. The rest of my life is the consequence of that answer. If you live in a small town or a quiet suburb, if you keep your life in ordinary rhythms, pay attention to the pauses. They hold histories. They hold names that were never spoken aloud. And when a place whispers, you might do well to listen. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.